And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to be here with all of you. It's a tremendous crowd already. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we have a very special guest, which is Dr. Joseph Farrell.
Take two.
Take two. As everyone knows who tuned in last night, of course, the previous two interviews that I did with Dr. Farrell were removed. And Joseph, they were removed. I want to give you the official explanation. Because supposedly we were impersonating a historical event. This is new.
Yeah, this is very new.
A little different.
We've arrived. When do we get our stars at Grumman's Chinese Theater? You know, I mean, it's just absurd.
That happened real early, and it happened on even different platforms. So there was something, and it was with both videos, not just the one video, but the first one that went down was the Mars Elite video. And I thought that was interesting, where we really went deep into the Mars aspects, the big push around Mars that we're seeing from Elon Musk and others. And it really is interesting that it's Mars. You know, he had a quote recently where he said, "I'm going to save the light of consciousness by getting us to Mars."
Oh,
that's pretty esoteric, my friend.
Yeah, it is. Kind of disturbing, too.
How'd you like to have Elon as the father of civilization?
Oh, no. No.
Joseph, I'm going to go right in here with SpaceX and Otrog.
Mm-hmm.
And the bizarre similarity behind these rockets and this rocket program they developed in the late 80s, and what Musk eventually wound up launching himself with SpaceX and some of the other weird things there. But what was Otrog, and who are the people behind it?
Well, Otrog stands for Orbital Raket und Transporten Gesellschaft. It's obviously a German firm, and they set up in the mid 1980s. And all of this, incidentally, was brought out by Mikhail Gorbachev.
Right.
We wouldn't have even heard of Otrog or this compound in the Congo, which is kind of like the West German version of Area 51, if it had not been for Mikhail Gorbachev accusing West Germany of running this compound, building cruise missiles, bio-warfare capabilities, and everything else. But the firm itself was a firm that was designed to create booster rockets for very cheap launches. So if you go look at the pictures of some of those Otrog rockets, they're modular. Right. So you just fasten however many rockets you need to a central core to boost whatever payload you need. So that's Otrog. Interestingly enough, one of the people on the board of Otrog was Dr. Kurt Debus, whom we've talked about many times.
Yes.
Who was this Nazi rocket scientist, so to speak, that was during the Apollo moon missions. He was the head of the flight planning at Cape Canaveral. So this is the guy that's in charge of the moon launches. Dr. Davis was also very peculiarly, shortly before he retired, he was placed as the head of NASA's UFO Bureau.
Right.
And then he retires and goes on the board to Otrog. If you know my books, Dr. Davis was also involved in some capacity, we don't know exactly what, in a project having to do with the Nazi Bell. Kurt Davis was not a rocket scientist. His specialty was high voltage plasma and measurement. That's, to me, a dead giveaway about the Bell. He was a very close associate of Dr. von Braun. So, this Otrog entity, whatever it was, I think, certainly a part of the German deep state, black projects world and all of that stuff, especially with someone like Kurt Davis involved with it.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, you mentioned Elon Musk. If I remember correctly, Daniel, and I'm going on wobbly memory here, but about a year and a half ago, I think it was, someone sent me an article And I couldn't verify it, so I never blogged about it. But someone sent me an article that was tying Elon Musk to OTROG somehow.
Mhm.
And, how
Yeah,
that works
this,
in there, I don't know.
yeah,
But, it's very suspicious. But you're right. There is a resemblance between what OTROG was up to, trying to create very cheap modular launch vehicles, rockets for space, and what Elon Musk has been up to with SpaceX. So I have to wonder if OTROG was somehow kind of a beta test of some cheap rocket launch capability that they've now farmed out to people like Bezos and Branson and Jeff Bezos and all these other people want to getting into space.
exactly. And this is interesting because, of course, this brings in the whole secret space program aspect because we stopped going to the moon in 1972, which is a great anomaly and a huge gap of time, 50 years to next year. And, Pence, when he was in with Trump and they were putting things together, they said, with NASA, we're going back to the moon 2024. A couple of days ago, NASA said, hold on, the Pence plans are out. We're not going back to the moon on that date. Maybe later in the decade, we'll see. But Joseph, that got scratched. So something's going on with the secret plan piece, and suddenly Mars has to be the complete dominant thing as far as news coverage goes.
Yeah, I find it very odd that we've had these let's go back into space deadlines. And there's a pattern as far as I can tell, Daniel. King George Herbert Walker Bush the first came out with that announcement. I think it was 1987 or 88. We got to get back into space right away. And then Clinton's elected, and that's out the window.
Yeah.
Then we get Bush the stupid elected, and we got to get back into space, by such and such a date. Then along comes Obama, and that goes out the window.
Right.
And then Trump gets elected, and we got to get back into space. We've got to be on the moon by 2024, and we got to be on Mars by. And now it's out the window again with Biden in office. So I have to wonder, is this all just, make-believe bipartisan theater, or is there a real tug of war going on here? And during this tug of war, the other thing that's been appreciably noticeable, as you're very well aware, is they've been coming out with all of these videos of UFOs and conferences, and they're pushing the ET meme, and it's all of a sudden Mars.
Yes.
So, what's going on here? I have no idea, but I'm very suspicious of the pattern.
No question. And, well, so many of your books in the Giza Death Star book series are about the ancient technology and basically these wars in space that took place a long time ago. The Cosmic War in particular goes through that. And you've said that those books were laid out in a certain order as well. So the message for me is that it seems perhaps that there are ruins that they've discovered, say on Mars, for example. And you said once they discovered those ruins, something would have happened. And that would have been the deep state would have taken a look at that and said, where are all the ancient documents on Earth concerned?
Right. That's exactly what I think happened. You can't tell me that, the face on Mars photo that Viking took, the very famous face, that was noticed by two NASA scientists, and they originally thought exactly what the narrative later came to be. Well, this is just a trick of light and shadow. But then they found another picture that was taken by Viking from a different sun angle and a different position, and it's still there. So it's not a trick of light and shadow. And at that point, NASA starts putting out the narrative that, well, this is just a big trick of light and shadow. But they're in doing so, and Hoagland laid all of this out in his numerous papers and books on the subject, that at this point NASA is creating a narrative that pretty much went against its own scientists who discovered the pictures. So what I'm suggesting is, at that point, they realized we have a genuine anomaly here. And that is going to require the deep state to take action and do some analysis that they're going to keep hidden from us. And I firmly believe that as a part of that analysis, they're going to go back and look at ancient texts, that Eric von Däniken, people like that were in the popular view at that time, were talking about this idea. So they're going to do this. The other reason I think they're going to go back and look at ancient texts is you've got a UFO problem at the end of World War II, and they are interfering with our national defense bases, particularly our nuclear bases.
Mm-hmm.
Shutting down ICBMs or turning them on in the Soviet Union.
You're right.
Take your pick. And this is a genuine national security problem that they are going to have to study and take some sort of action on. There's no way that they're going to ignore it, but we're not going to hear about it. So if they all of a sudden realize we've got the possibility of some ruins here on Mars, then the implication is that implies a technology. And if you go back and look at the ancient texts, I put a lot of them in the book, The Cosmic War, or Gives the Death Star Destroyed. If you look at those ancient texts, it's very clear, if you read them with modern eyes, that they are talking about a technology.
Right.
Very clear. I mean, in the Enuma Elish, the so-called Babylonian creation epic, and I defy anybody to sit and read it and tell me that this is a creation epic. It's a war epic.
Right.
Pure and simple. Quackademia likes to cover things up by giving it a name to make you think, oh, these people are just making all this up. It's Babylonian science fiction. No, it's not. Well, if you look at it, if you look at the Enuma Elish, you've got this big war between Marduk and Tiamat. And what's Tiamat fighting with? Well, she's fighting with biological weapons. Miscegenation, scorpion men, and all of this weird monsters that she's cooking up in her cauldrons.
Right.
So in other words, we're doing this today with modern genetics. We're creating these chimerical creatures. So it's not surprising that you would find it in a text related to a cosmic war, which you're going to have technology to fight. That's my point. Yeah. So these people are going to go back and look at these texts and realize that they've got a problem. And that's, I think, what's behind the scramble for Mars. They want to go out there and get that technology.
Right. So they're convinced that there's enough, or they probably already know at this point that there's enough there that they can reconstruct the idea of what took place. So they're taking then those ancient texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh or something of that nature, as factual. They've changed their perspective and realized, oh, they're not mythical creations for academics. They are rather detailed histories.
Right. They're histories using language that the people recording them at the time had available. So, the idea that they're going to talk about scorpion men, well, they don't have a word for miscegenation, but that's what they're talking about. They're talking about genetic engineering. So you kind of have to read these texts and bear in mind that you're either dealing with myth or you're dealing with people that are trying to record something very real in the language they had available. And that's what I think these people, that would do this analysis actually did. And as well as I do, Daniel, that if you examine some of the photos coming from Mars recently, they are just chock full of things that should not be there.
Right. No question.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of stuff that you've pointed out. You did mention that Hoagland was very early on this.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that he got into were the whole complexes in Sidonia and that whole thing, which look kind of like versions of Giza, but up there. There were also the strange comments that Buzz Aldrin made in relation to some of the moons and how they had found things there, as if he couldn't kind of help himself. It spilled out. So, and we've seen it echoed through movies like 2001: Space Odyssey and all that kind of thing. So the idea is there. it's out there in the culture as early as the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When we look at it now, they've had years to study it, and the last 50 with no public program except for, Challenger shuttles and things of this nature, which are real fluff when you get into a space program. What do you think marks the 50-year gap of space development that the public hasn't seen in general? What's the kind of the core factor you think that is going on?
I think the core factor is this realization that human history is not and I think I mentioned this in the previous videos, human history is not this accidental history of humanity doing their hunting and gathering, and then all of a sudden quitting and deciding to invent mathematics and astrology and animal domestication and start Sumer and Egypt, out of the clear blue,
Yeah.
Which is a narrative that never made sense to me.
Let's make a geometrically perfect pyramid, everyone.
Yes, let's make a perfect pyramid out of copper and sand slurry and diorite balls and hand saws.
Hey, the mines didn't even have the wheel, supposedly.
Yeah, the mines didn't even have the wheel. The poor things.
Good luck throwing those stones over there.
Good luck throwing those stones up there. Yeah, go look at Chichen Itza and tell me these people didn't have the wheel. Come on. But yeah, this is the problem. They realize that history is not as Quackademia would have it, or they had to invent that history real fast because the end of World War II, you've got a bunch of stuff flying around the sky that's going to grab attention and make people wonder. The other thing I think that's at the core of this is the technology aspect. Once you come to the conclusion that there was a high civilization and that it may have been interplanetary and that it fought a war and it was a terribly destructive one, a blown up planet right here in our solar system. Once you come to those conclusions, then you would have to be totally irrational not to want to go out and get that technology, particularly at the height of the Cold War. Yes. Because, if those records are true and that technology existed, or there may be some of it left or enough information about it that we can piece it back together, we'd better get there before the danged Ruskies do.
Right.
And on we could go.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because there's a CIA record that was declassified about them placing agents inside the ARE Casey Foundation. Mm-hmm. In the 60s to try to find out about what people knew about the Hall of Records under the Sphinx and if that was real, because Casey had said the Atlanteans left their records there about this 2-eye advanced stone, this crystal that was a power station. Mm-hmm. So certainly there are things we know that they've searched for Noah's Ark, for example. Mm-hmm. So when they're engaged in this, in fact, a lot of the things that we see, it takes place very often in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And we've also seen geopolitical situations there in the Caribbean around this. But they are engaged, in fact, in archaeological wars.
Yes. They're engaged. I think what you're looking at, Daniel, is you're looking at the continuation of the Ahnenerbe-Dienst. That Nazi organization that sponsored all these archaeological projects and so on. But remember what Himmler said when he established it. He said that this is for the purpose of utilizing any potential military potential that it may represent.
Wow.
So in other words, we're looking at that same agenda just carried on into modern times, as far as I'm concerned. And I totally think that the insertion of American forces into Iraq for the ostensible purpose of preventing Saddam Hussein from acquiring weapons of mass destruction, I think there was a certain truth to that. Because the way I look at it, part of the agenda, the hidden agenda there, was to go into that country and see if they could find any of those records any of those cuneiform tablets, any of those hidden technologies. That's what I think Saddam Hussein was looking for.
Oh, yeah.
So they trot out Colin Powell and, give a speech about weapons of mass destruction. And most people are going to think, oh, A-bombs and chemical weapons and biological weapons. They're not going to be thinking in terms of an ancient technology or information about it. But that, I think, was definitely one of the hidden agendas there. And the same thing with Mars.
Yes, absolutely. We know the looting of the Baghdad Museum was bizarre on a number of
totally.
Because ordinarily they never would have allowed that to happen.
No, never.
And they had complete control over those various things. And there was some confusion even about who was in there and looting.
Right.
And at a certain point, people said, oh, these people are dressed up as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But you've pointed out before that this is a little switch of uniform.
Yeah.
About who was in there, and the groups that were in there doing archaeology were in fact German,
German and French,
German. Yeah,
French and German archaeological teams. And this is what makes me suspicious about that whole story. And my take on it is that the archaeological teams themselves, which before we went into Iraq, we told the French and we told the Germans, get your people out of there, and they did. But here's the problem. The Baghdad Museum looting was reported first by Der Spiegel in Germany, interestingly enough.
Oh.
And they're the ones that pointed out witnesses saw people in American uniforms going into the museum and hauling out these crates. All right. Well, anybody can put on an American uniform. Right. The Germans have an intelligence service too. The French have an intelligence service too, and they certainly know what our uniforms look like.
Yeah.
So they can dress anybody up and give a false flag. But the thing that interested me is that the Baghdad Museum incident, when it was first reported, they said that people knew exactly where to go and exactly what they were looking for. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that the archaeological teams themselves would be keeping field reports of what they find. In other words, you're on an archaeological dig and you find something interesting at such and such a depth level and at such and such a location in your dig, and you write down the location of what you find, the depth at which it was found, a brief description of what was found, and so on and so forth. But no one, Daniel, since the Baghdad Museum looting has ever made reference to the field catalogs of those archaeological teams doing the digs.
So
no one. It's a glaring omission.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking to recover this stuff, the first thing you're going to do is consult those field reports of the archaeological digs. And here's the problem. No one has. So I'm wondering if we even had access to them. Somebody did to go into the museum and haul that stuff out of there. And the finger of guilt points directly to the French and the German teams.
Mm.
They're the ones that would know what was in there. Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting because Hussein seemed almost obsessed with getting at these archaeological digs.
Yeah.
And he had archaeological digs all over the place.
Yeah, he had them all over Iraq. And I think, Hussein's not a stupid man. And he's going to be reading the same text that everybody else is reading and looking at things like the Epic of Ninurta and say, oh, well, that's a Sears catalog inventory. Let's go find the stuff.
Yeah. That's true. They found evidence of electroplating in Iraq.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah.
And the Baghdad Battery.
And all of the other weird stuff that you see on those cylinder seals. I just before we came on air, someone sent me an email of an article that they found a cylinder seal, and I looked at this thing, and Daniel, I'm so gobsmacked by what's on this cylinder seal that I have to wonder if it's even real. Did somebody just make this up for a joke?
Wow.
Because what's depicted on the seal is a bomb. It looks like the Fat Man plutonium bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki.
Wow.
That's what it looks like.
Incredible.
And then next to it, there's this tree-like thing that could also be a mushroom cloud, and inside the mushroom part of the cloud, there are all these little arrows, like, you know, lightning bolts and stuff. And I'm thinking, you know, either someone's having a pretty good joke here, or this cylinder seal exists and it's depicting something that, you know, shouldn't be around in the 40s.
I would love to see this, by the way.
Yeah, it's just, you know, I'll blog about it probably next week, because, you know, it's one of those stories that you have to speculate about. You know, you just have to. So here you have a bomb in a mushroom cloud.
Wow.
Babylonian. Yeah, it's just, and it wouldn't surprise me. We do know that in Egypt, you go to Dendera in Egypt and look at some of those so-called hieroglyphics, and you're looking at jet airplanes and helicopters, and Tesla coils,
moving right on down the line. Too.
Moving right on down the line. Yeah, I know. Anyway, so yeah, I think.
Well, what's interesting for me about this is, for example, with the Epic of Ninurta, some of the things that they say in there are incredible. One of the things you pointed out is that they say, you know what? Here's an inventory of the weapons you need to destroy. Oh, guess what? We actually don't know how to destroy this. So what are we going to do? We're going to
hide it. Yeah.
So this thing is so powerful, there's no way to just bury it.
No.
Right? They have to kind of actually get rid of it.
And here's the problem. Let's go back to something I mentioned in the videos that were taken down because we're impersonating historical events. But I still want my star in Hollywood, by the way, guys.
You deserve it.
So, well,
the best impersonator. I'm trying to figure out, by the way, which event we were impersonating.
Yeah, I you know, give us a hint here, guys.
Is it the moon landing?
I don't
Mars rover?
We were talking about moon landings and Alternative 3 and everything else, so who knows what.
Yeah, it was getting pretty out there.
But anyway, here's the problem. You know, if they're hiding some of this stuff according to the Epic of Ninurta, then where are they hiding it? Where's the likely place? Well, if you're looking on planet, the likely place would be obviously somewhere in Mesopotamia, or maybe Egypt, who knows? But if you're thinking in terms of off-planet civilizations, well, one place to hide it would be the moon or Mars.
Yes.
And here's what I find so uncanny. If you read the Epic of Ninurta, you've got this Babylonian god that's named Nergal, Nergal.
Right.
Nergal is the Babylonian god of Mars. He's their god of war. Nergal, if you look at the derivation and follow the name through history, Nergal becomes Erikal in Babylonia. Erikal becomes Hercules in the Greek mythology, and later becomes Ares in Rome. So in other words, you're dealing with the same dude here.
Right.
So anyway, the creepiest thing that I ever encountered, one of the creepiest things I ever encountered, was when Richard Hoagland first began looking at the face on Mars and created his Mars mission project and got all of these experts together to, you know, help put together a case for why this was not just a trick of light and shadow. He had an artist do a profile of the face on Mars based on computer modeling and so on and so forth. And you look at that profile and then compare it to a little picture of Nergal from Babylonian reliefs. And the resemblance between the two is, I put it in Giza Death Star Destroyed, this comparison. The resemblance between the two is palpable and chilling.
Interesting.
So if there's, you know, I'm thinking if there's a place you're going to look for some of this stuff, go to Mars.
Mars. It's interesting because, of course, von Braun wrote a science fiction novel about a civilization on Mars, and his character, the leader of Mars, was named
Ellen.
That's pretty good. Apparently, he had the ability to predict things there, Joseph.
Apparently, he did. You know, I don't know if many people know this. Von Braun's mother was reputed to be a very good psychic.
Interesting.
But what I find even more interesting is given von Braun's connections, with what I've been calling Nazi International, is he really being precognitive, or is he letting out a little detail that he just happens to know about? And
Right.
my bet's the latter.
Yeah.
Because again, you've got that strange article. I'll have to find it about Otrog and Ellen. Otrog and Ellen.
Well, he'd been known to let things out before. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons you suggested he got fired from NASA was because he had actually let out something about the moon mission that wasn't known.
Right.
Which was about the shape of the moon.
No, it's the gravity.
The gravity.
There was a Time magazine article shortly after the moon landing where they put one of these boxes, like they do at the bottom of the page. And in the box, they had done a little interview with Dr. von Braun. I remember this. I saw it. That's when I decided to write von Braun. I'm 13 years old, and hey, so I wrote him. What's up?
Did you get a response?
Oh yeah, he wrote a very nice letter back. He didn't answer my question, but he wrote back.
That's great.
But anyway, I'm like, what's going on here, Werner? but he gave a little interview, and he said that the equigravisphere, the neutral point of gravity between the Earth and the moon's gravitational fields, was somewhere around 23,500 miles from the surface of the moon. And I'm like, what?
Wow. Yeah.
Because that means the moon is much more massive than much less massive than we've been told. Pardon me, I got my figure wrong. He said it was 43,500 miles from the surface of the moon, not 23,000. So that means the moon is much more massive. And I'm thinking, okay, there went right out the window all of those weekly reader articles that I used to read when I was a kid in elementary school about, the astronauts on the moon being able to leap to tall buildings and drive golf balls, because the gravity's too dense. And if that's the case, how do we get off of it?
Right. Well, getting off of it was always bizarre anyway.
Oh yeah, that's
pointed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting up there is one thing.
Yeah. Getting off is the other problem.
Joseph,
here's the problem. If the moon is more massive for whatever reason than we've been told, or it has these these concentrations of mass beneath the surface of the moon, which is documented, that would explain why all of those early Soviet and American probes went either careening wildly by the moon and shooting off into space, or slamming into it, because they're dealing with the wrong figures.
All right. Yeah. And they probably, we probably enjoyed the fact that they had the wrong figures.
Well, at least for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially those groups inside of NASA that were known to really hate the Soviets.
Exactly. Exactly.
Let me ask you this when we're talking about this aspect, which is, you were citing this like Hercules, Mars, thing. So let's go into the kind of occult window on this for a moment. When we look at Mars, the symbolism of any other planet is, this is the one that is the war god. So what are they doing promoting Mars on this level? Why is Mars the goal for civilization? And, Bezos was talking and he said, from now on, we're going to have people living on Mars and living in space. And, only certain people will live on the Earth. It'll be like a resort. This kind of talk. What is it that's going on there mythologically, symbology? What are they doing with that?
My suspicion, that's an excellent question. And I have thought about it. And the one thing that stands out in my mind is that with the emphasis on getting back to Mars and establishing a human colony there, that it's ultimately an act of rebellion. Because if you look at Mars in mythology, it's always not only connected with war, but in some cases, particularly if you look at the way the Babylonian texts treat this cosmic war, it's really kind of a civil war in the pantheon of gods.
Right.
And a certain segment of the pantheon is in open rebellion against the rest. It's Tiamat versus Marduk. And you get a hint of that even in some of those passages in the Enema Elish after the war. It says that Marduk remeasured the structure of the deep, which is a very, very telling phrase if you're approaching this from the standpoint of a physics that's being talked about. Because all of a sudden you're missing a planet in the solar system. That's going to interfere with the celestial mechanics of the solar system from that point out. It's gonna knock it all into a cocked hat. And you're going to have to reestablish order. Well, if you look at the god Marduk, he is really kind of a god of order. He's kind of a descent, if you will, from Enlil, the great Babylonian god of order.
Mm-hmm.
And so Marduk is reasserting this order after Tiamat's rebellion and all of that. So I think part of it is this quest for power, for ultimate power, and looking at it mythologically, a kind of a rebellion against established order. So that's part of it in my thinking. And Bezos coming out and saying, well, a few of you lucky folks might get to continue to live on Earth, but we're going to ship the rest of you off into prison-like conditions on Mars.
Nice guy.
Yeah, real nice guy.
I think paying those Amazon warehouse workers $12 an hour has gone to your head.
Yeah, exactly. What are we laboring for here, Jeff? Is
right, exactly. Space colony slavery, right?
Space colony slavery. There we go.
Yeah. This is
I don't even fly. I don't want to get on a rocket. Thank you very much.
You've made a point about a lot of the things that they're claiming they will do with space with chemical rockets don't make sense.
No.
Asteroid mining and things of this nature. It's not going to happen.
I mean, come on. Did you see the cartoons? And I'm literally using that word advisedly. Did you see the cartoons that NASA came up with when they first started talking about going out and mining asteroids? Did you see some of the artist pictures?
Yes.
Remember those big Dixie cups that they were going to go out there and scoop up these asteroids with chemical rockets? And I'm like, guys, come on. Not all of us are this stupid. It ain't going to happen. It's just not. So, yeah.
So they're still using the cover story of the chemical rocket.
Yeah, they're still using the cover story of the chemical rockets, but you're not going to be able to mine asteroids with chemical rockets and make it, in my opinion, cost effective. And the other thing we've got to remember, we've had, ever since the end of World War II, we've essentially had a secret space program going on with lots and lots of money sloshing around in the system to build all, God knows what, underground bases, ionic propulsion, who knows? But it ain't going to be chemical rockets that are doing this. There's just no way.
Absolutely. I mean, even during the Nazi period, they were working with other technologies.
Yes.
And that's 70, 80 years ago.
Yeah. And again, you had a 2-track space program there. You had the rockets, von Braun. And, once the rockets are up, who cares as far as they come down? Just like the Tom Lehrer song. But then you also had this very exotic technology that they were working on, with things like the Bell. So you had a 2-track system there early on.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, you look at some of those Nazis that I think were writing about that exotic technology, and they were already thinking, let's use this in psychological warfare.
Oh,
and
right.
yeah, so a little shade of Project Bluebeam there.
Yeah, right,
if you want to get down to it.
Yeah, they were ready then. Well, is it fair to characterize a lot of the Nazi space program as controlling things on the ground from space, basically?
I think so.
Yeah. I want to dip back into this archaeological piece for a second. It's a story that you told me, and it relates to this book, The Thrice Great Hermetica, which is an interesting book where you go through so many different eras. It's quite fascinating, and I want to recommend it for people who haven't seen that one. But in there's a story that you bring out, and it's in the later part of the book, about the Germans doing this kind of quest for the Grail. And the Nazi party being very obsessed with this, them also having a very sharp identification with sacred objects in general. But there's the whole story about this crown and the Templars that I thought was interesting on that front. Can you give us a little bit of that story?
Yeah, there was a German scholar by the name of Otto Rahn, R-A-H-N, that was very interested in the story of the Templars and the Albigensian Crusade and all of that occurred in southern France, which was nothing less than a genocidal. There's no other way to interpret it. It was a genocidal crusade to get rid of the Albigensians. And Otto Rahn had been in southern France because he was looking for the Grail. He thought that Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, the medieval story of the Grail, was actually based on history, and it was based on the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars. And he came back to Germany. He published a book, and then the book caught the eye of one Heinrich Himmler. You know, talk about a man you don't want reading attracting his attention. So Himmler actually contacted Rahn, inducted him, forced him basically to be inducted into the SS, and sent him back to southern France to, continue searching. And if you read Rahn's books, they're very, very interesting. The guy was clearly onto something, but he ran across a local French shepherd down in the Languedoc, and the shepherd told him, "Oh yeah, we know all about that crusade." What they were looking for were the jewels in Lucifer's crown, and that really grabbed Rahn's attention, because Rahn had come to the conclusion that the way that the Grail is described in Parsifal was as a stone, not a cup, a stone.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a very interesting thing, because the shepherd told Rahn that actually Pope Innocent III, the man behind that genocide, wanted that stone for a stone to put in the papal tiara.
Wow.
Talk
Incredible.
about. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because if you look at the stones in Lucifer's crown, they're the same stones that you find on the ephod of the Hebrew high priest. They're exactly the same. And supposedly Lucifer lost one of these stones in his crown when he fell, and Innocent III was looking for it and thought it was in the Languedoc, which I find very interesting, because there have been reports of people trying to find these stones from the crowns, and you've got a parallel in Tolkien's Silmarillion with Morgoth's crown, or Melkor's crown, and the missing Silmaril, the stone.
Oh, yes.
So it's very, very interesting lore that's out there, and for Himmler to latch on to it is very, very interesting, because this tells me that Himmler was already thinking there's something down there and we got to go get it. And the story ends in 1944. Get this. ends in 1944 when they send Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, to the Languedoc to look for something. Reportedly, Skorzeny telegraphed Himmler, "We found it." Himmler then, and this was after Himmler had dispatched the von Salza SS regiment to the Languedoc. Now, that name should ring a bell because Konrad von Salza was the first Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's symbolism. There's symbolism all over this place.
Yeah.
So supposedly Skorzeny telegraphs Himmler, "We found it," and then Himmler sends this airplane skywriting over the Languedoc. I don't remember what it was supposedly skywriting, and then Skorzeny and company abandoned the Languedoc because the Allies had just invaded southern France.
Fascinating.
And, this is another part of the story that gets shoved aside. There was no military reason, none whatsoever, for the Allies to launch an entire D-Day sized invasion of southern France. By that point, the German armies in France are collapsing and they're hightailing it back to the Reich as fast as they can. And I've always suspected, I'm not the first one to suspect something here. Senator Joseph McCarthy pointed out that this was a useless, unneeded invasion on the floor of the Senate.
Yes.
But I speculate that no, we knew that the Germans were looking for something, so we went into southern France to find out just what the heck are they doing down there.
It's the archaeological wars.
It's the archaeological war again,
which often piggyback on the back of the real thing.
Yes, exactly.
That's really fascinating. The quote from McCarthy is odd too. Because...
Yeah, it sure is.
He's getting into some stuff there, and it's like, what are you talking about exactly?
Senator McCarthy. When I read this, Daniel, I just I had read this speech before, many years before, but it didn't register with me. So when I was doing the McCarthy book, I went back and reread it, and I just thought, you've got to be kidding me. Here's Senator McCarthy on the floor of the United States Senate giving this long speech about General Marshall. And he's excoriating Marshall for this unneeded, unnecessary invasion of southern France. And he was not alone. This is important to remember. General Mark Clark, the Allied commander of Allied forces in Italy, asked the same question. Why are we invading there? That's useless. But McCarthy gives this long speech about General Marshall. And at the very end of this speech, there's this odd little reference. This is just plopped right in there about the Merovingian in the White House may know. And of course, Merovingians, here's a Roman Catholic senator dropping a very esoteric, abstruse reference to the Merovingian dynasty of France.
Yeah.
The dynasty that preceded Charlemagne. dropping this reference into a speech on the floor of the United States Senate and using it to refer to President Truman.
Yeah, right.
Now, folks, I don't care what you think about Senator McCarthy one way or the other, but to drop that reference, that's sending a message.
Yeah.
That only he and Truman probably ever really knew the full extent of what that message was. But given the fact that suddenly, decades later, we have Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code and Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and that whole thing with the Merovingians. And here's Senator McCarthy, 30
in the 50s there, yeah.
In the 50s, talking about Merovingians, southern
it's so France, strange. It
southern
really
France and invasions of it's not just strange. He knew something.
Yes.
He knew something.
It just stands out dramatically.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In the middle of that. And he's pressing also that general, basically saying, you had no reason to go into southern France.
Right.
obviously he knew that the military reasons were off the table. So he
Right.
wanted to bring all of that out. And this is a weird thing that you've mentioned in relation to McCarthy. I wanted to do a little aside on that because you've done a few very interesting books on McCarthy. But McCarthy also, as you found out, gets deep into the UFO file.
Oh, yeah.
And he's talking about Project Blue Book in 1953 and 1954.
Yeah, he's talking about 52 during the Monmouth Committee hearings. You know, Blue Book was not even really that publicly known. And
Right.
1952, you know, the context here for what McCarthy was doing is just astonishing to me, because that's the year of the big UFO flap in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And here's McCarthy running his probe of communist penetration of Fort Monmouth, which is doing all of this exotic radar research.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden and folks, you've got to understand, these transcripts that I'm referring to of his hearings about Fort Monmouth were not declassified by the United States Senate until 2003 under Senator Joseph Lieberman. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's another hole. And you know, Lieberman was the chairman of the same committee that McCarthy was chairman, you know, only decades later. But it was finally declassified in 2003, which, you know, when I made that discovery and found those transcripts were available, I thought, well, no wonder I haven't been able to find them all these years. The Senate was sitting on them.
Right.
So let's go read what old Joe was up to. So I buy the transcripts, you know, ended up being in a binder book about yay thick. And I'm reading through this stuff, and I'm getting all of a sudden McCarthy asking, oh, well, were your radar experts perhaps down in New Mexico and say like, oh, maybe July of 1947? You know, and again, this is over and over. This is not a one-off. He's pressing on this connection to New Mexico in July of 1947. Think Roswell, folks.
Right.
You know, this is not a stupid man. And he had an ironclad memory. I mean, he was well known for his ability to pull details out of his head. So this is not unusual. And then we get these curious references to Blue Book when he starts probing, well, where are these missing documents? Why did you destroy top secret documents? Where's the register for these? You know, on and on this goes. And the Army is literally stonewalling. So I think McCarthy, you know, he drops his Merovingian bomb. He's dropping little Roswell bombs
Right.
in the middle of these hearings. And the Army, you know, the Army is frustrated and it doesn't know what to do. And I think this is one of the reasons they set him up in the Army McCarthy hearings and brought him down. He was getting close to the UFO file, as you call it. There's no question. You can read the transcripts. If you can come to another conclusion, have at it. But I don't think there's any way to avoid it.
Oh, it's fascinating. And what fascinates me about reading those books is that it's Roy Cohn who's there with McCarthy, and he's pushing hard on these guys. It's almost like interrogation.
Yes, it is. It is, especially as you say, when Cohn is doing the questioning. And again, you know, who's Cohn connected with? Donald Trump. Yeah, Donald Trump.
No question. And he shows up in the weird documents about DISC that are released in the Torbett document.
Yes.
And he's associated with Defense Industrial Security Command.
Yes.
So Cohn, he sort of has a continuation there. He comes out of the McCarthy thing, knowing about Blue Book and all the rest. And then he's part of DISC, which is, again, part of that Industrial Security Command about the UFO file.
And good friend with the Reagans.
Yes. Cohn is that inside piece, and I think that he's the key also to Trump's entree into the political world.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Trump Tower in New York City would not have been built if it were not for Roy Cohn's influence. It just would not have happened. So in other words, the connection there is very, very strong, and it's very deep. Yeah. And as you've said many times, Cohn is the original swamp creature.
He is.
He really is.
Does it get any swampier than Cohn?
No, not in my opinion.
Joseph, there's something that's a very interesting tie-in. It just came out, and I want to get some of your quick responses on this. We haven't had a chance to talk about this, But Judge Andrew Napolitano was speaking with Gerald Solente recently, and he's talking about his relationship, his phone calls with Trump. And he mentions, because for a while there, they were friends and they were working together and they had a falling out eventually. But he mentions the period when the Kennedy records are going to be released, October 26, 2017. And he said, I was on the phone with the president and I said, are you going to release those documents because the public needs to know and all the rest? And that Trump said to him, and this is his quote, he said, Trump said, if you knew what was in those records, you would know that I can't release them. Now, we know that Trump did release some of them, but the CIA went in that morning and blocked all the records from their end. So Napolitano pressed him, and Trump said, Andrew, trust me, the things that I've seen in those records, we could never, you would know, you wouldn't release them either. So my mind instantly went to the kind of catty UFO file explanation piece. And also, you know, because we know that the CIA would have tried to extricate anything out of there and make themselves look good. I had a thought, which is speculation, but that the CIA director that the Kennedys put in might have left something in there that they just, you know, it was an ironclad thing, impossible to remove. So their best game, their best play was to just block it from release. What do you think of those comments?
Well, I'm not surprised. And like you, I'm inclined to think that it has something to do with the UFO file. Because let's look at the constellation of connections here in the big picture. We've got McCarthy at Fort Monmouth doing his probe, and over again, the UFO issue is coming up. And it's coming up. It's important for people to understand this. McCarthy is a very smart man. And when he starts probing these types of areas, he will always speak in code. So in other words, he doesn't blurt out Roswell. He blurts out July 1947 over and over again. You've got the UFO flap going on in 1952 as the hearings are taking place. So in other words, this is not a stupid man. He knows what he's dealing with. And then you've got Kennedy, who is, through his brother Bobby, closely associated with McCarthy.
Right.
Okay. The Kennedy family was very, very closely associated with McCarthy, donated money to his campaigns. Bobby Kennedy secretly visits McCarthy's funeral, and on we could go. John Kennedy conveniently sidesteps the censure vote against McCarthy, so, you know, arranges that he doesn't have to be there.
All right, it's time for back surgery.
Yeah, it's time for back surgery now.
that was a good move.
It really was, you know. But then Kennedy gets into office after Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech, which I'm sure they talked about, you know, in their private discussions before Eisenhower left the White House. And then Kennedy comes out, I think it's in mid-1961, thereabouts, where he orders the CIA to go through their entire UFO files and find out which ones can be pulled to share with the Soviets, because he wants to have this joint moon mission with the Soviets. And Nikita Khrushchev is just about ready to give in to that when Kennedy is assassinated and Khrushchev is placed under house arrest and overthrown. You know?
Right. Yeah, right. That was pretty fast.
Yeah, that was, you know, it was lightning speed after the assassination. So I think there's a UFO connection hovering in the background of all of this. I'm in agreement with you. Plus, we have that strange association between, as you pointed out, between the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, Colonel Byrd, a relative of Admiral Byrd, of Operation High Jump fame. Folks. Yes. You know, on we could go. So I think this whole thing, you know, Kennedy managed to piss off so many people, but the core of it, the deepest, hardest core of it is, I think, having to do with UFOs and space.
Yes.
There's no doubt in my mind that that's the case.
It's like the gigantic historical omission
Yes.
there. And that's how we get into the situation in 2021 where you have the CIA trying to run phony UFO disclosure, and we still don't know anything.
Right.
It's fascinating to me, and I do want to get into this a little bit deeper because Kennedy, on a certain level, dealing with this, he is saying, "Oh, I'm going to open this up. I'm going to share this information with the Russians," and that whole group that's inside NASA, which already constitutes a kind of secondary space program,
Right.
they're already kind of doing their own experiments and their own stuff, and von Braun is in the heart of that.
Right.
And this Davis character, of course, he's in the middle of that as well. When the death of Kennedy is investigated later in the 60s, and it's 67 when the Garrison investigation, everything that he does, and remember the records that are blocked, all 12 of the files on the CIA side about Garrison are all blocked. Jefferson Morley is that Washington Post reporter who put those details together. So you can't get the Garrison files. But it's interesting to me because, and you pointed it out, which is Garrison runs over and over again into aerospace and the U.S. file, which doesn't make any sense to him.
Yeah, it doesn't. Garrison runs into three things. And if you look at what the three things are, it's very peculiar. He runs over and over again into aerospace. He runs over and over again into these weird church associations hovering around David Ferry and Guy Bannister and those people. And then he runs into this very strange financial system that seems to be somehow coupled in. You know, he calls it Murder Incorporated. And that's where we get the phrase. It's from Jim Garrison and this whole Permindex outfit and so on. So in other words, Garrison stumbled across the same network of connections that Kennedy ran into. Kennedy, let's remember, Kennedy decides in June of 1963 to have the Treasury print up $4 billion worth of United States notes, debt-free notes, bypass the Federal Reserve completely.
Well, it's incredible.
It's incredible. And in retrospect, I think Kennedy knew to some extent that there's some sort of hidden system of finance backing all of this weird aerospace stuff up. I really do. And he's coming off of Eisenhower and Eisenhower's disgust with the military-industrial complex, and on we could go. So Garrison stumbles into the same network of connections that he's really investigating are behind the murder of the president. So again, I don't see that you can look at the Kennedy assassination and come away from it without at least having an awareness that space forms some big component of what all of that was about. And as you say, here we are at the end of this arc of American history that begins with that assassination. And what are we hearing? Oh, well, we've got a UFO problem. There are ETs up there on Mars or wherever, and they're flying this stuff around our skies. And it's all coming out of the CIA.
Yeah, right. The trustworthy branch of government.
A trustworthy branch of government, if there ever was one.
With honorable officers like Lou Elizondo.
Yeah.
Like that.
It's just, yeah, and the drone king, you know.
Well, John Brennan cares deeply about the UFO file. I want to mention something to you here, which is about Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, who was known as the drone queen because she was Brennan's undersecretary there. She's his deputy going on. It's interesting to me. So she comes out yesterday, and we did a program on this last night. This just happened now. They did the UAP thing in Washington, and she was sitting down there, and she said, well, it seems like they could be extraterrestrial. And she messed up the word strangely. And I thought, oh, that's a weird thing for her to do. She stumbled on it. But UFOs buzzing U.S. warships may be aliens, right? That's the headline there. And there she is. So, you know, that sends ripples around the world, of course. You've got the director of national intelligence, which is supposed to be the top of the whole branch. We know the CIA actually rules, and the DNA is kind of this overlay. But anyway, she's basically the mass coordinator of all our intelligence, and she's saying it's aliens. So the Russians are sitting back there and thinking, what?
That's the question to me?
Yes.
Okay. Sit down. pour yourself 3 fingers of your favorite adult beverage. If I were the Russians, here's what I'm thinking. Let's assume I'm an FSB analyst and I'm looking at this theater of disclosure, if you want to use that word, coming out of the United States about UFOs and ETs.
Right.
My question is, where is that Chinese defector?
All right.
What in the name of sense has he been telling the Americans? This was the head of Chinese counterintelligence, which means that this man probably had deep insight into China's UFO files, which China doesn't talk about very much.
Exactly.
And he defected not to the CIA, but to the DIA, which was the very agency that John Kennedy started because he didn't trust the CIA.
Excellent point.
So I'm wondering, I really am, Daniel, why have we heard no more about this man? What exactly is he telling them? And why is the CIA reacting with all of this UFO talk? I think there's a connection, in other words, between his defection and what we're seeing now. And they are either prepping a narrative because they don't like what he's telling them, or they're trying to get ahead of whatever it is that will eventually come out. This man is very important to this whole UFO story, I think, in my opinion. If you're the head of Chinese counterintelligence, that's the desk that's going to be handling anything UFO related for the People's Liberation Army. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. And it raises the question of why did he choose now to defect? What's going on there? You know, there's something going on, and I think definitely it could be UFO related. Absolutely. China's when you look at the announcements that the Chinese space program has made since that defector defected, it's bizarre.
Yeah.
Because China's saying, "Oh, we want to build a kilometer-long mothership up there." And, you know, they're testing all of these hypersonic missiles. And meanwhile, there's all these explosions happening inside China that China's not talking about.
Right.
Something is going on, and I think it's UFO related. And moreover, I think if you look at these explosions in China and Russia in the past few years, I think we're in a hot war of some sort. I really do.
Yeah.
You know, I thought when that Tianjin chemical plant exploded a few years ago and looked at the crater of that thing, I thought, no, that's not a chemical explosion signature. That's a deep penetration deep into the surface of the earth. So something's going on, and I don't know what it is.
Trying that defector into the UFO side, that makes a lot of sense because we've gone into a whole weird zone around UFOs where this media, this government, they can't talk enough about UFOs after completely dismissing the subject for 75 years.
Yep.
And it's a very uneasy thing, and it was very clumsily done when they rolled in there and they were like, you know, here's this goofy TTSA and here are all these New York Times articles. And it was interesting. The first thing I noticed when the TTSA came out was the presence, the open presence of CIA officers on the board. They had over 100 years of CIA officer experience. Over 100 years on their board. I mean, you know, that's not just like, hey, we have one CIA advisor. It's like the whole thing is a CIA outfit. And now something interesting is happening, which is about Avi Loeb, because it seems like they were pushing the UFO threat there. They were trying to get this in the media and hyped up. And somehow with the UAP report from last June, that sort of fizzled, the threat part so far. And they seem to be now incorporating this idea, and Avi Loeb suggested it. And here's how it works. Oh, Oumuamua came into this system, and it was actually an alien probe, and it's AI, and we need to get our AI up to snuff so it can communicate and give us all these wonderful this knowledge about our planet. And, Loeb, while he's doing all this, he's like, we have to take a scientific approach. So he creates the Galileo Project, which is started in June. And the two people he just recruited into it, though, were Elizondo, CIA man, and Chris Mellon, again, W's defense, intelligence coordinator guy, Iraq War and all that junk. So the same faces, just rearranged now around a scientific board. And now we have him sitting down with the director of national intelligence and Bezos and being like, hey, these aliens are there, and we're going to communicate with them the same way, we need to get up to snuff on AIs the same way, like our kids now are good at tech, and like the older people aren't so good at tech. And that's the same position that we're in with AI. So we get our AI up to snuff, and it'll communicate with these aliens and and everybody will live happily ever after. So
as the orchestra plays Nearer My God to Thee, and you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Where are they going, Joseph, with this, with the UFO narrative? They've tried to take it over now. That it's it's out of the domain of the UFO researchers, many of which got confused by the TTSA thing, apparently. And now the mainstream media, they want to own this whole thing, and the CIA wants to run it. Where are they going with this?
I think they're prepping a narrative. And I think they are prepping the threat narrative.
Yeah.
And the reason that they're doing so, Carol Rosen said it, is so that they can weaponize space.
Yeah.
Now, that raises the question, are they really dealing with real ETs, or are they just faking it? And I'm about 50-50 on that. Because if you've got exotic technology to begin with, you can easily fake that sort of thing. And I'm going back to saucers, swastikas, and psyops with Otto Skorzeny,
right? And
his report that I've just seen something remarkable in terms of some sort of exotic technology. He never specifies what it is. Magda Goebbels' wife, Dr. Goebbels' wife, even talks about this in her diary. And he comes up with this idea, well, let's use this exotic technology for psychological warfare.
Right.
So, it could be that scenario. But then again, they could genuinely be afraid that they're dealing with something like that is imminent, and they're trying to get ahead of that narrative too. It's one of the two. It's one of the two.
That's really interesting. The fear aspect is interesting to me because, of course, they always do exaggerated things when they're afraid.
Yep.
SDI, Star Wars, Iran-Contra. There's a fear thing going on in the middle of that. And we found out later through Gorbachev. Gorbachev came up a couple of times today that this is something the Reagan White House was afraid of, which is they thought a UFO invasion is imminent, and they wanted to throw in with the Russians on it.
Well, let's remember Gorbachev's response was an unhesitating, of course, will help.
Yes.
He didn't hesitate. It was right, bang. Right. He didn't have to stop and think about it. And what that tells me is, well, the Soviets were afraid. And if you look at, Daniel, you mentioned the fear factor, and I think you're absolutely spot on here, because if you look at the whole COVID narrative, the Great Reset narrative, and so on, these people are in a hurry.
Yeah.
And they're acting afraid of something.
Yes.
And they're making egregious mistakes.
Yeah.
Because of it. Because they are in a hurry and they are afraid. They're making some egregious mistakes. Their narrative is collapsing around them. No one trusts them. And for good reason, no one trusts them.
Exactly.
So they are, if they are facing that kind of threat, the only thing that's going to save their butts, as far as I'm concerned, is a real honest transparency about whatever it is that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
They've tried every narrative in the book: climate change, global warming, all of this stuff is collapsing. And the one thing that isn't collapsing is the UFO problem.
Right.
And they're still trying, now all of a sudden, after 70 years of one narrative, we're getting the complete opposite. Tell me that that's going to ensure or engender trust.
Exactly. This is the problem, because they're not trustworthy to start with.
Right.
Around this, they've lied.
They've killed a president. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, let's get into
And a
the
lot of his family.
Yes, exactly. And they kept the records hidden for 58 years on
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
Thank you for transparency, America. I mean, I made the point that even in, when Khrushchev took over Russia, he was like, yeah, Stalin did some bad things. Let's take some of those statues down. These guys will not take their own sacred cows and be like, okay, Dulles organized a plan to kill President Kennedy, and it involved all these Wall Street forces and all the rest, and he used these CIA people to do it. Do that and clear the record. Well, it's not going to happen with these people because, they're up to their necks in it. But it is interesting to me, and I'll go back to that Napolitano quote, because what could be in there that would make Trump afraid to reveal those records? It would have to be something beyond just hey, the CIA participated in this, because everyone sort of knows that.
Right.
So the UFO file comes up again, and then the director of national intelligence now, she's coming forward. We had James Woolsey, who was Clinton's former CIA director, and suddenly, you know what, Joseph, he wants to talk about UFOs too. And he has a story about his friend who got, his plane got stuck because a UFO went by. He's got all kinds of stuff. So, we're obviously looking at a situation where all the intelligence people want to rush to the front. And what's amazing is in the case of Brennan, he's like, the government shouldn't withhold that. He was the CIA director. He knows the whole thing. He could easily let it out himself.
Right.
So that's a completely that's a facade going on there about we need transparency. So the question is, if they want to assign everything to the UFOs as alien now, they're finally willing to come out of the box and say, we're under an alien threat. The op there is on the threat side. Right. They also can operate with hey, AI is here to save us from the evil aliens.
Yeah, they're setting things up so that they can play this or spin it any way they wish. The only problem that they really have is if they really are dealing with ET may not like to go along with the narrative, whatever they choose.
Exactly.
That's the big problem.
Oh, yeah.
That to me is why they're spinning the threat narrative, because, way back years ago when we did the Bastard Secret Space Program conference, I pointed out that if you are the national security establishment in the late 40s, early 50s, and you're dealing with this UFO phenomenon, you either have to capitulate or you have to set up a program where you're going to emulate the performance characteristics of UFOs and demonstrate a capability. And this is the key part here. Demonstrate a capability to engineer systems on a planar, if not stellar, scale.
Right.
Because if you can do that, then you're demonstrating that you've got a capability to make life awfully complicated for whoever it is that may be a threat to us. Okay. And that's what I think is going on here. They are ginning up the threat narrative so that they can roll out some of this stuff. They're ginning up the Great Reset, social credit, digital society, surveillance society, because they need the planet locked down to deal with whatever it is out there that they think they're dealing with. Yeah. Or they're going to fake it. See, the fake narrative plays into that scenario just as easily. If we fake an alien invasion, then we can get away with imposing global martial law and a global surveillance system. So they're pushing this narrative because I think if you look back, Daniel, I don't know if you're familiar with a document, a hoaxed document, incidentally, called Report from Iron Mountain.
Yes.
Have you ever read that?
Yes.
Well, in the Report for Iron Mountain, supposedly it's a group of the global elite getting together to figure out how they can rule the world. What sort of scheme can we come up with? And that report lists the environment, geophysical change, and ET. Well, the environment narrative seems to be pretty much fizzling. I mean, they keep trotting it out, but it never gets anywhere.
Exactly.
And that leaves basically geophysical change, which means you've got systems of a planetary scale that you can engineer that sort of stuff. Think Fukushima, Think the convenient Haiti earthquake, all sorts of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Or the Indonesian tsunami, as Catherine Fitz has pointed out. And then you've got ET.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are.
You're right. That's really interesting. Well, we know there was a real report.
Right.
I always thought the Iron Mountain thing is strange because
oh yeah,
it does actually let out a lot.
oh yeah.
But we know that the Brookings Institute looked at this in 62, 63 and said, oh, we can't release any information. It would impact society badly if they knew about the whole ET thing. And we know they looked at it in the 80s under Reagan. What's interesting to me is it seems like they got to a point with the technology on their end where they're comfortable saying that on their side that they could stage an incident. And that gets into von Braun's prediction, which I think is relevant.
Yes.
Because so far the stages that he's talked about have all come true.
Yep. In exactly the order.
Mm-hmm. And the final one was alien threat. Yeah. And that we need to weaponize space as a result of that. And then the caveat at the end was it's all a lie.
Uh-huh.
So that brings us back to the alien thing, because actual UFOs and the things that we've seen and the reports that we've had, you made a very interesting observation, which was that the UFOs themselves, if they're studying them, don't exhibit a signature, a physics signature outside of this solar system.
Right. There's only one instance that I can think of where you have a physics signature that is suggestive of an interstellar capability, and that's those strange space shuttle videos where you see these circular things kind of spinning, and they pop into view, and they've got a hole in the middle of them, and a little notch on the outside of the rim of these things. Well, they sort of pop into view, and to me, that's either a signature of something popping in from hyperspace, so to speak.
Right.
All of the Hollywood CGI.
Yeah.
Or it's a signature of a stealth technology that's being turned off. It's one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that one case I think things are open, but in no other case have I seen, this is my problem with UFO reports. I look at the physics signatures. Are we seeing signatures sufficient, compulsive, and sufficient to indicate that these are traveling here from another star system? I'm sorry, I don't see it.
Interesting. So if they're in this system,
right.
This is interesting because where do you, obviously there's lots of UFO activity on Earth and outside of Earth, but where in this system do you think that activity is coming from?
Saturn. Kronos.
Why Saturn? Kronos, yeah.
Gigantomachy.
Yeah.
The War of the Gods. Norman Berggren, the ringmakers of Saturn and all of that stuff. You look at just the moon of Saturn, Iapetus. My question has always been, what did George Lucas know and when did he know it?
Yeah, right.
Because you look at that moon and it looks like the Death Star.
It does.
There's no two ways about it. It does.
It's remarkable.
It is remarkable. And the odd thing is it's got those straight edges. If you look at those pictures, it's not round.
Right.
It's straight edges.
What is the problem here?
Yeah, what's the problem there, folks? When was the last time you looked at a planet's limb and saw straight edges? That's a problem. There's all sorts of strange stuff. There's that asteroid that Hoagland pointed out many years ago that the European Space Agency decided it wanted to go photograph, and it looks like a diamond. It looks like a magna-cut diamond.
Yes.
On and on we could go. So it's coming from inside the system, and if you look at the anomalies of the planet and the moons of Saturn and compare those to the ancient texts, the whole Greek gigantomachy is started by Kronos. That's the name of Saturn in the Greek mythology. So what's going on here? I don't know.
Interesting. That is really fascinating. I will say, for Berggren's sake, when he did come out and talk about his book from the 80s, which is remarkable that he had this information, he stuck completely to all the original details. And he said, well, they briefed President Reagan on that. Mm-hmm. So Reagan was hearing about gigantic ships refueling there in the rings of Saturn. That would be enough for him to say, let's get Gorbachev at Reykjavik immediately.
let's talk to Mikhail right now.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I have a couple more questions for you, and then we're going to take questions from everyone. How's it going out there?
Great. Fantastic. I have too many questions already.
Okay. We'll make sure to get you out of here on time, however. And it's great to have Dr. Farrell with us. This episode and us doing it live is great to have everyone here, because the two videos that we did on Mars both got taken down unceremoniously. And the explanation, as I said at the beginning of the program,
you're an impersonator, Daniel. How dare you?
Impersonating a historical event. Okay.
Please let us know what it is.
I'd like to know which one, so we can stop offending the system.
Yeah, so we can stop offending with our brazen impersonation.
And I do want to mention that book you mentioned, Soster's Swastikas and Psyops, that's your book. And it's a very interesting, I want to make mention of the fact that you have a series of books there from 2014, 2013, 2015, which presage so much of the UFO stuff coming out. And it really is remarkable to go back and read those books, because it's so much of the things that we're hearing about now, and it's all laid in there. So you had incredible insights going into this. Now, the thing I want to find out about where the national security state is at on this is if they're coming forward and doing their own UFO events in Washington, D.C., and the representatives are the Amazon guy and the director of national intelligence, and Avi Loeb over here at Harvard, who I know you'd love to have coffee with sometime. What stage are they at with this? If they're developing this threat narrative, they're still measuring, will it be accepted, let's say?
Yeah.
And they've got a lot of data from the lockdowns and everything else that suggest, okay, here's pockets of resistance, here's things that we did that worked, and here are things that didn't work. But now the media every other day is promoting some, every commercial has an alien theme to it. And one of the things I found really fascinating, and I mentioned it on the show last night, it's an area of steganography I'm following, but I want your input on this. And it has to do with President Biden, and I use the term extremely loosely.
I always put an asterisk behind president when I mention him.
Well, you do the Biden-Yanko, which I really like.
Yeah.
That's more like it. But Joseph, he keeps talking about Satchel Paige, and Satchel Paige is, a baseball player that was in the Negro League in the 40s and had a great record. But him saying this is telegraphed all over the world, because they're saying, oh, he misspoke, he used this word that's not used anymore, and all the rest. But when meeting with Francis, our good friend Francis, he wants to talk to him about Satchel Paige. So one of the things that bothered me about all that was that, I looked into it and found out that there was this Mars rover named Spirit. And from 2006 to 2010, they had a number of discoveries. One of them was called the baseball diamond there. And they started naming all the aspects out of members of that Negro Baseball League. So one of them in that list was Satchel Paige. So the points of connections in steganography here, with him going around talking about Satchel Paige with the Pope, would be, we found ancient ruins on Mars, and now everybody in this kind of field has to get ready for it. They've been getting ready for it for a long time. The Pope himself made mention of Martians. It seems like the Satchel Paige reference is a setup again to this Mars piece. And you pointed out that the Mars piece relates to ancient technology. The question is, how do you roll that narrative out? And is the aspect there then to change the human origin story and rearrange religion and spiritual beliefs on the planet?
Well, I think that's part of it. They've been trying to do that a long time. I got bad news for them. It's not going to work, but I do think that's a part of it. I think in terms of a stage that they're at now with this, is I do think they're prepping a narrative, and I do think, and I totally agree with your observation that you made earlier, that it looks to me like they're in the measurement stage. They're still calibrating the social engineering aspects of this to see how many people are going to pick up on it and go with it. There's a big problem that they have, and that is, my impression is that they are not convincing a certain segment of the ufology community with all of this stuff. I think there's too many people that have woken up that are looking at everything the government does with a suspicion that it's some sort of manipulation. Right. So where they're going to go with it, I don't know. I don't think, in one respect, that they're ever going to come clean, and that's the archaeological warfare aspect of the story.
Right.
That would require admitting too much about what they're up to, which I do think they're up to that they are looking for that ancient technology. Absolutely. And they want to get their hands on it. That there's behind, my way of viewing it, Daniel, is behind all this narrative about taking Dixie cups and going and scooping up asteroids and all of this stuff. They're telling us that they're looking for something, and they're going to do it under the guise of commercializing space. And here's the important point. This is going to be done by corporations. Anything corporations find out there by way of technology will be proprietary.
This was the problem.
This is the problem. Yeah, this is the problem.
This is the problem that goes back to Eisenhower.
Yep.
Yeah. And Eisenhower thinking, in the case of continuity of government, if we do get nuked, it'll be good that not just the military has this, that it'll be good for the corporations to have it.
Right.
But what happened was that process got abused.
Yep.
And the aerospace companies and the defense contractors, they have too much of the tech themselves.
Yep.
You've talked about how the NASA... Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, they will be able to keep it completely quiet.
Right.
So in other words, whatever policy the government does is not going to affect their own decisions about whether or not they're going to release any of this technology. I really think that the push for the surveillance society is because of the existence of this technology, because you've got a proliferation problem with it. The technology, if you know a little bit of basic, electrical physics, you can do it in a garage if you want to. And I'm exaggerating, but you take my point. That's a real proliferation problem. They had it with Tesla,
right,
100 years ago.
Yes.
So they had no way of surveillance. Now they've got the means to do it. So that's the other thing that I think bodes for rolling out this technology is once they get their grid in place, which again, I don't think they'll be able to do. But in their thinking, once they get their surveillance grid into place, they think they can safely roll this stuff out. And again, if there are real ETs out there, they may not want us to roll this stuff out. Cosmic war again.
Yes.
Don't build any more big cannons, Germany. Oh, look, we found some old blueprints, 20 years later. But, that, that didn't work, and it's probably not going to work again. So they're in a mess. They have boxed themselves into a real difficult situation with all their secrecy. And I think, going back to Kennedy, I think Kennedy saw it and saw that it wasn't the way forward.
Right. He had a number of speeches trying to get rid of that secrecy piece, realizing that ultimately it undercuts the culture. If you have one part of it going one way and the other part moving along, there's going to be too much of a schizophrenic relationship from the top to the bottom. And it's interesting, actually, because when I think of what they're doing around the UFO file, now we have this pops into my mind immediately, which is Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence that we talked about, who did this big event yesterday. Well, her specialty is theoretical physics. That's an odd thing for an intelligence honcho.
Yeah.
That's a Joseph Farrell kind of
odd thing. It's kind of an Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, doctor in quantum chemistry type of thing.
Yeah, right.
Oh, really, Angela? You did that too, did you?
Hey, she doesn't have to be Hitler's daughter.
She doesn't have to be Hitler's daughter. She knows exactly what CERN is up to, and she's helping fund it,
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly.
I find this interesting. So the theoretical physics signature is around, and suddenly Gillibrand, I should mention this, which is something we've discussed, which is Senator Curtin Gillibrand out of New York, the one who got appointed there when Hillary went off to become Secretary of State and bomb the hell out of Libya. Gillibrand now is coming out, and she's a UFO crusader. If you can't get that UFO thing going, you don't have any dignity. And she really is she's been appointed. There's a Democrat. I pointed out the Democrat from Arizona earlier, who is a congressman, and suddenly the UAP train is there with him, Galeo. So they have all these Democrats coming together. And the Republican side, they've got Rubio, right? Who was running the UAP task force. But they're going into this big push going on. And she just announced in her, congressional record, she read it into the record that she wants an amendment to this year's NDAA. And she wants this new department, ASRO, to study anomalies. And, that this is the whole UFO thing. They want it institutionalized on the inside, and, they're going to take it seriously. The only problem is, they're all Democrats, and except for Rubio, and then collectively, they all seem all of a sudden to be playing right into this UAP narrative out of nowhere. So we have that going on. We have this big conference, and then we have Bill Nelson, who you blogged about just recently, the head of NASA, and suddenly he wants to talk about ET, but he talked about something else too.
Remind me.
Non-state actors.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. The fact that they're willing to admit that, to me, is another interesting dot to connect. And the reason I think it's so interesting is because it was another Democrat, Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, William Cohen, that also talked about non-lethal weapons. Remember that?
Yes.
And what did he say? Well, our biggest concern is that these things are getting into the hands of non-state actors.
Right.
Like that weird cult in Japan. And he specifically mentioned that.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, an acknowledgement that at least a part of the deep state is finally admitting that there's an actor on the stage here on this planet that they have not reckoned on before.
Right.
Or at least they haven't admitted. Now, I think they've known about it for a very long time. They were in bed with it. So that, to me, is another little telltale clue that this could blow up in their faces. That non-state actor or actors may not want to play along with their narrative, or then again they may. The other odd thing here is, let's go all the way back to the Brookings Institute. I find it very odd that the Brookings Institute mentioned religion as one of the primary problems that they would have in making any disclosure. And of course, again, I think they totally misread the situation. But I think the misreading is to a purpose, namely that they intend to use all of this stuff, as you've said, to reinterpret human history
That's it.
and reconfigure, the world religions and so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, the ETs and all this stuff are not going to make one whit of a difference to Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, because they've been talking about this stuff for centuries.
Right. Yeah.
Come on, guys, get with the program here. But the other thing that the Brookings report mentions that I think is extremely interesting is that they were also concerned equally, not just with the possibility of contacting ET, but stumbling across their remains and artifacts.
Oh,
It's right there in the Brookings report, plain as day.
that is really interesting.
Yeah, it's right there. And they mention it in the context, which I find even weirder still, in the context of exotic things like electrohydrodynamic drives. That's their term for it. That's not me. That's the Brookings Institute.
Yeah.
Well, what the heck is an electrohydrodynamic drive? Could it be things like electrogravitics, ionic propulsion? Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But they had something in their noggins that they were thinking about in the same breath that they were worried about religion and stumbling across extraterrestrial artifacts.
Remarkable.
Yeah. It's really bizarre.
Wow, that is a great catch.
Oh,
actually.
yeah. I put it in Covert Wars or Breakaway Civilizations or one of the two Covert Wars books. But it's there. It's there.
That really makes me think, because let's talk about an ancient state actor.
Okay.
I'm going to go into some Casey stuff here for a second. There's a Casey reading when they're asking him, the Atlanteans, he describes these power stations and flying machines, and he's talking all about these things that can fly through things.
I remember that.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting physics.
Yeah.
At one point, they say, well, what would this stuff be comparable to? And, what exactly were they like? And he said, well, they were like the ships that Ezekiel described, but at a much later date. In the Bible, Ezekiel describes that incredible ship.
The wheels within, yeah.
Yes, the wheel within the wheel and the faces and everything. But the interesting thing is, of course, Atlantis had long passed, and so somebody still had access to this, according to Casey, looking at the record there, the Akashic record. Who's got that? Who is maintaining Atlantean technology in that period to show it to Ezekiel many years later? And again, Ezekiel, they portray him as the shepherd and all this kind of stuff, but when he speaks almost like a scientific, a science major, like he's giving a lecture on it. So he's also describing something. What is it between Enoch and Ezekiel and this Casey looking out and saying, oh, the Atlantean technology is like the stuff that they're describing, but that's a much later date? Somebody has it.
Somebody either has it or hid it. I don't know who it would be. However, I've always maintained a suspicion, and it's purely speculative. I have no hard evidence for this. But if you look at the Renaissance, and particularly at Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, Cosimo de' Medici is the one that found a copy of the Greek text of the Hermetica. He had been searching for it. He actually found it, and later, had Ficino stop all of his translations of Plato and translate the Hermetica. That's why we have the text now. Cosimo de' Medici.
Wow, and remarkable.
Yeah. And Medici used all of his intelligence and financial connections to find it. He eventually bought a copy from some people in Byzantium that had it. And what this tells me is, number one, Medici knew something ahead of time to go looking for it. And the fact that he was able to find it and then insist that it be translated and publicized at a time when people thought that the Hermetica represented an ancient primordial wisdom from Egypt.
Right.
So what I'm getting at here is, while the technology didn't survive, the concepts behind it did.
Mm,
And
right.
this is what Medici's glomming onto. And after that, then you have a very interesting statement in Paracelsus, Theophrastus Bombastus Philip von Hohenheim, to give him his, or her. It may have been a her. You know, that's the other.
The fact that you remember that name right off the bat, though, that's remarkable.
well, how can you miss a name like that? But Paracelsus says something very interesting in his writings about esoterica. He says that if you look at the ancient Hebrews, if you look at the ancient body of wisdom, it became fragmented into three parts. The Egyptians got the component dealing with Mat, or what we would probably call now the energy of the medium. The Babylonians got astrology, and the Hebrews got Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to say, with that fragmentation of what used to be a whole, if you look at the wanderings of the Hebrews, they are in Egypt, then they go to Palestine, then they get whisked off to Mesopotamia after the fall of Jerusalem, and then they come back after Cyrus the Great releases them. And he says, if you look at it a certain way, it looks almost as if someone is using the Hebrews to try and put all of that fragmented system back together.
Interesting.
So this is the way they're thinking about all of this during the Renaissance. And the most interesting thing about all of this is a scholar by the name of Isaac Casaubon, I talk about this in Thrice Great Hermetica, came along, an English scholar, and did an etymological study of the Hermetica and concluded that these texts do not date from any Egyptian period. They are post-Christian texts right around the 2nd to the 3rd century. Okay, so the whole bag of air inside the Renaissance humanist esoteric occult movement just sort of collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the 20th century, an Oxford scholar went back to look at Casaubon's case and said, you cannot treat the ancient idea of authorship the same way, because authors will ascribe things to a precursor on the basis of a resemblance of concepts. And if you look at the concepts in the Hermetica, they are very clearly Egyptian.
Right.
They're just Hellenized or Greekified, if you will. So again, the argument has flipped once again, totally, completely flipped from what it was in the post-Renaissance period. So I think you have to look at these people like Raymond Lull and Cosimo de' Medici and Paracelsus and all of these people during the Middle Ages that are dabbling in these alchemical texts and these Hermetic texts because they sense there's a technology behind these concepts.
Yes.
That's how you explain alchemy. And alchemy itself, I wrote The Philosopher's Stone, and I've pointed out what most people don't want to acknowledge about alchemy. And that is, if there were so many failures over such a period of time, why did humans keep researching it?
Yeah.
And then you get those little odd statements that every now and then somebody may have actually pulled it off.
Yes.
So the key point here being, you read in alchemical texts about putrefying dung, some of the stuff that they were trying to used to create gold out of base metals. You read these strange references to putrefying dung. And then along comes that little bacterium that they discovered circa 2010 that eats a bunch of stuff and poops out gold.
Yes, right.
Okay. Maybe they were onto something.
They had that in the 14th century.
And they had that in the 14th century. So here we go.
Well, this is interesting because I'm reminded of the Moses story since you mentioned Hebrews. And I think of the Exodus, and I think of those 40 years wandering there in the desert. But they're getting manna from heaven from this kind of circular thing.
Oh, I think it was monatomic gold.
Yeah, yes, this is what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, I think it was monatomic gold because you have these strange Egyptian references to something called it's literally misfit. It's MNPFZT.
You're right.
Fill in your own vowels. But clearly, Lawrence Gardner pointed out that there's a place right across, right where it would be opposite the Suez Canal today. Of course, it didn't exist back then, but there was this place where there's some sort of big smelter or foundry where the Egyptians were literally making gold or burning gold, which is, an extremely high heat. So that's what I think this was, There's lots of alchemy going on in some of those passages when you read them, if you read them with those kind of lenses. So again, somebody's preserving this knowledge somewhere.
Well, it's interesting because I've done a lot of research recently on Andrew Carnegie.
Mm-hmm.
And his absolute obsession with Egyptian ruins is one thing, but the real obsession is dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
And he has to have his people, as soon as there's anything anywhere in the world, his team goes out and they lay claim to it and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like he's engaged in a quest like this to find
Mm-hmm.
something that's going on back there. And, the official story that we have related to dinosaurs 65 million years ago, this all disappeared. There's a weird thing, again, going back to Casey now, he's talking, and they say, describe something about the Atlanteans, something important about a particular era they were in. And he said, well, in 50,722 BC, they had to all get together with all the scientists, like a worldwide broadcast, to deal with the dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he also suggests that it was their own meddling that had created them. So like a Jurassic Park circa 50,000 BC.
Think Tiamat in the Enuma Elish.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
The Scorpion Men.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What is the obsession that somebody like Carnegie has with Egyptian ruins and dinosaurs? Is that the thing that you think they're looking for?
I think they're looking for signs of a technology and the use and application of it. Right. And in Carnegie's case, Carnegie was a rough contemporary of the German archaeologist Koldewey. And I've mentioned Koldewey in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. He's that strange German archaeologist that was looking at the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, helped recover the Ishtar Gate. The reason it's in Berlin is because of Koldewey. And if you look at the Ishtar Gate, well, you've got a cow and you've got a bird, and then you've got this weird thing in the middle called a sirish. Remember that?
Yes.
This thing has the 4 feet of a panther or some big cat, the hind legs of some big bird, a tail like a scorpion, and a head that's kind of a mix between a dragon and a cat.
It's like a chimera.
It's like a chimera.
Yeah.
And Koldewey's problem was, what are the Babylonians doing putting this thing on a frieze with animals that actually exist?
Yeah.
The context here is all wrong. And then he gets into the texts and discovers that the Babylonians were keeping a couple of these things around in their zoos.
Yeah, right.
So
wow.
World War I is going on, and Koldovai says, well, I might as well come clean. So he publishes his findings that he thinks this was a real existent creature in 1918, as the height of the wars going on. So nobody really noticed what he'd done until long after the war was over and they actually read him. But yeah, this type of stuff is going on, and Carnegie, he's going to eat up anything like that.
Right.
He's going to absolutely eat anything like that up. So I think again, you've got a bunch of people looking for something. They know there's something wrong with the quackademic history of things, and they're trying to find out what it is.
They're going to keep it in the loop of just a small group of people who are in the know on this, and they have the kind of weight and power of the Carnegie Foundation.
Right.
These types. Rockefellers did it later. They used people like Sitchin, for example, in the same way. And the Smithsonian is another incredible example of this.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about
it. Fascinating.
Did you know that my Uncle Bob, during his career in government, was the budget director for the Smithsonian?
No.
Dr. Robert Lee Farrell. Yep.
Fascinating.
Yep.
And did you learn some things there?
No. But I haven't seen my Uncle Bob in about 20 years. And at the time it didn't occur to me to ask him.
Sure.
But I'm sure that probably there's something he could tell me. I do remember as a kid touring the Smithsonian when he had just got the job, and he took us around and showed us a bunch of stuff that most people don't get to see, and it was quite fascinating. They had a lot of stuff.
Wow.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah. It's remarkable. And I'm glad you mentioned Gene's Giants and Monsters, because you do a very interesting take on the giant aspect and how it was covered up.
Mm-hmm.
And it does suggest very early scientific manipulation.
Oh, yeah.
Around these things. There are references in the Bible that sound like it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The bed of Og, the king of Bashan, if you take the biblical measurements, this guy was huge.
Yeah.
I mean, huge. And you compare those biblical references to these Babylonian cylinder seals, where you've got these little tiny people bringing gifts or something to this big, huge guy sitting on a throne. And
right. I've seen some of those.
Yeah.
If you look at it, it's like either you have an incredible ego or there's a problem here.
This is either metaphor or it isn't.
Yeah, right.
That's only two ways about it. And the Babylonian term for king, I forget, Lugal. Oh, what's the name for king? The word escapes me now, but the word for king literally means big man.
Yes. The giants.
The giant.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's two pieces back there which they've never shared with us. The giants and these elongated heads.
Yes.
Because that you see throughout these different cultures, and you're like, what are they?
Mm-hmm.
And then we know there are primitive attempts to try to recreate them in cultures, but who were they to start with? And why do we have Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and they have it displayed not like other pharaohs? Other pharaohs have, that kind of brave looking, I'm on my chariot throwing an arrow. With this thing, they want to portray them with the very, very long heads, and then they have very strange hats on top of that.
Yes. Yeah. And again, we may be looking at kind of a cargo cult phenomenon where they're just imitating something that they've seen.
Right.
Which makes sense to me. It makes more sense than the standard quackademic explanations. Let's put it that way.
There's no question about it. And we can see that stuff, as we go along, right after they found Göbekli Tepe, and they said, well, look, this is 12,000 years old. That blew away all of the arguments that everyone had. And we have to give people like Steiner and Casey and all those people credit. They said, no, this goes back a long time ago. And the pyramids are 10,000 BC in Casey's arc. But, in your Giza Death Star books, they go back a lot further than that.
Yeah, I think so.
One of the interesting things mentioning the Casey stuff is when he talks about the Giza Plateau, he says, oh, yeah, when they were scoping this out in 10,500 BC, they were doing archaeology.
Yeah, and actually, if you read the Edfu temple texts in Egypt, they will say the same thing.
Interesting.
If you're familiar with those texts,
Yes.
yeah,
Um,
they will say essentially the same thing.
Joseph, the dating for ancient Egypt as a sophisticated culture, where does it actually go? Where would you place it?
I think Egypt is much older than standard academic Egyptology says. I think there's a good possibility that you're looking at something that may go back 20,000 years.
Yeah,
I really
absolutely. The other piece, it seems like those cultures that picked up on it, the Sumerians, Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, is about the planet that is destroyed and then becomes the asteroid belt. In some cases, they even give it a name. But what is the function of that piece in your own work and in the Giza Death Star book?
Well, the exploded planet.
Yes.
I think that planet, the basic function is that planet was deliberately blown up in a war.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at the Enuma Elish, Tiamat is the name of a planet, and Tiamat is destroyed. If you read the 4th tablet of the Enuma Elish, it recounts the destruction of Tiamat, and it's a very odd description, because it says essentially that Marduk blew wind into Tiamat, okay, repeatedly, and then took his spear and burst it. So if you read that from kind of a physics point of view, you're loading energy into an object, or in this case a planet, that it cannot damp, and then you hit it with one final pulse and kablooey, it blows up.
Wow.
So I think Tiamat is basically that planet that was blown up. And the 19th century astronomers, that when they discovered the asteroid belt and hypothesized, well, the planet blew up, you know what they named it?
No.
Krypton.
Interesting. Right. Yes. That is really fascinating. And we've never been given a good explanation for the asteroid belt.
Never.
Doesn't exist.
The only one who revived that exploded planet hypothesis was Dr. Tom Van Flandern. And, you know, I put this in my book, The Cosmic War. When you read Van Flandern trying to figure out a possible model or mechanism for what happened to the planet, well, the first thing he says, well, maybe there was, and no, you lay down. Maybe there was an unstable fission reactor in the center of the planet that went critical and blew it up. But he's not satisfied with that for good reason. So his next model is, well, maybe there was a bunch of antimatter in the core of the planet under some sort of containment, and the containment broke down and kablooey, the planet blew up.
Wow.
And again, he's not satisfied with that for good reason. And so the final thing that he says is, or it could have been the result of some deliberate action.
Oh, that's it.
That's it. Yeah. And that's the last thing he mentions. And he doesn't elaborate on it, but it's the one that makes the most sense when you compare them to the other two models. And again, you know, it fits the ancient texts that this is what happened. So in other words, there's a technology around somewhere, folks, able to blow up planets. And we've got an odd thing around Saturn that looks oddly familiar, you know. So yeah, I think, you know, George Lucas's galaxy a long time ago and far, far away is right here.
Something that he was aware of.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah.
Which is
Anakin Skywalker, Anunnaki.
Yes. Yes.
The Force, Mott in Egypt, 0 point energy of the medium, on and on we could go.
Right.
So as far as I'm concerned, he's telling a mythology right about our own celestial neighborhood.
It's really remarkable. The last thing on Mars, and it relates to this, John Brandenburg, he was in the Secret Space Conference with us. He did remarkable lectures in a book about a nuclear explosion on Mars. He was convinced of it based on his research. And also, we both noted he was a government scientist, so he was allowed to come out and say these things, which is also kind of weird. His conclusions about a nuclear signature on Mars, what do you think?
Oh, I think they're absolutely true. Because what he's talking about is the high presence of the isotope xenon-129 in the Martian atmosphere. Xenon-129 is only produced in nuclear explosions, fission explosions. Now, Brandenburg is talking about a thermonuclear device, a fusion device of about 1,000 megatons, which is enormous, but they are possible. You can build fusion bombs to any size you want.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly if you're going to build them in the standard way of having an atom bomb set off the fusion bomb, that atom bomb is going to produce a lot of xenon-129. So I think he's made a very solid case.
His approach and his research is so unusual and doesn't seem to have any corollaries to it. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's just out there in isolation.
Yes.
It's when you plug it into all this other stuff, you have to sit up and take notice.
Absolutely.
Because that means somebody let off a really big bomb on the planet Mars.
We'll take a couple of quick questions and then we'll let you go because I know we're keeping you.
Okay, so since we only have time for a couple questions,
Yes.
I'm going to start with a big one.
Okay.
Summer Forever wants to know, can we talk about the Antichrist?
Antichrist.
I've said this many times to whoever asked the question, that the template that Mr. Globaloney is following, in my opinion, is a dispensationalist theological template. That they are literally trying to put into place a, Catherine Fisk calls it a beast system, and I happen to agree with her. That's exactly what they're trying to put into place, economically and financially. The problem is, and I hope you will hear me here and think about what I'm about to tell you very carefully. Dispensationalist theology requires the belief in its standard American versions that when Christ said it is finished, he really didn't mean it. It requires the belief at some point of, in its usual American version, of the restoration of Israel and of animal sacrifice as a means of communion with God. This is a completely anti-Christian view, because from the very beginning of the church, it is very clear that the teaching of the church is that the work of Christ finished all other systems of sacrifice and did so once and for all. So any restoration of that system or talk of doing so is, from the standpoint of traditional biblical Christianity, heresy. The other problem is, if you look at, I'm thinking of Clarence Larkin, for example, or Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of a watered down version of Clarence Larkin and his Bible maps of the ages. If you look at the way that theology talks about the end time, you first have Antichrist setting himself up literally in a restored temple in Jerusalem and proclaiming himself as God and demanding everybody worship. Now, who does that sound like? And then Christ comes back, kicks the Antichrist out, puts himself in the restored temple, proclaims himself as God, and rules with a rod of iron. Now, here's the problem I have. Other than the timeline, there is no difference of character between the two.
Huh.
And if your timeline just happens to be wrong, if you've misinterpreted all those Bible problems or Bible verses, you're in a whale of a problem. You're in a kind of deception. For me, the key thing here to remember is that the resurrection overthrows the kingdom of death. So the kingdom of Christ is not of this world, as he himself said, because that event breaks the law of karma once and for all. So it's got nothing to do with what's going on in the Middle East or any of this stuff. It's got everything to do with your own spiritual life and whether or not you are in virtue or not. That's the key. So any system that's diverting you to look at political events in this world, yes, they may be end time fulfillments, but not in the way you suspect. The fulfillment is the deception. So I hope that makes some sense for whoever asked the question.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
good question.
An emphasis on false prophecy.
It's an emphasis on a false interpretation of a real prophecy.
Right.
And that's the problem here. There are other interpretations out there, but I guarantee you the dispensationalist interpretation, whether it's premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, any of those dispensationalist interpretations are simply foreign to the vast majority of the church fathers. They simply don't talk about it. There's only one who does talk about it, and that's Irenaeus of Lyon. But the rest of them, they just don't think in these terms at all. In fact, the book of Revelations itself is the only book of the Bible that is not read liturgically in the Orthodox Church.
Oh, interesting.
For a very interesting reason that I will talk about some other time. Anyway, I hope that helps.
Yeah, and since you mentioned that, this is actually a good piece, which is I wanted to ask you, John of Patmos, when he's seeing this incredible vision of Revelation, and you mentioned the beast system and everything, what is happening to him that he has this incredible vision?
I think what you're dealing with in many cases is, and I'm going to sound a bit nutty here, I think you're dealing with a case of kind of remote viewing precognition.
Yeah.
Because if you look at certain statements in the Gospels, you get kind of a retrocausation. And this is incidentally the way the church fathers think. When they look at statements of Christ claiming to be God, I am that I am, or I am the way, the truth, and the life, all of these I ams. Well, every time he says I am, he's taking the name Yahweh on his lips. That's what Yahweh means, I am. And in one case in the Gospel of John, he uses the emphatic version in Greek. So in other words, in Greek, you can say I am simply by saying imi. But when you say ego imi, I am, you're emphasizing a claim. And he uses that language in the Gospel of St. John over and over again. And in one particular context, which is very interesting, he says, Amen, amen, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am.
Right.
So in other words, the way the church fathers look at it is that Christ is making the claim to be Yahweh, not that other guy. You remember, he says, you are a liar and murderer. You are of your father, the devil.
Yeah.
And he was a liar and murderer from the beginning.
Right.
So they look at all of those Old Testament theophanies, the burning bush and so on and so forth, as literally being Christ himself. And they will also say, if you read certain church fathers, that when the Lord is walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, it's actually Christ incarnate that is walking with them. So there's a retrocausation that you're dealing with, and it's kind of time travel, if you will. And I think this is the phenomenon that's at work in a lot of these things like John of Patmos.
Fascinating. And I remember the reaction of the Pharisees when he says, before Abraham was, I am. They say, oh, you're not even 40 years old. Get out of here. What are you talking about?
They pick up stones. And, they're ready to stone him to death.
They're obviously not.
They're not happy about that.
That's Olivia.
Tricky Vicky, would Bezos and all these people be flying into space on a tour if they thought there were any threats up there?
No. But then again, they haven't flown very far into space. My question is if they had the opportunity to say, go visit Saturn,
Yeah, it might be a different story.
would they hop on that bus? I wouldn't. No way. No, it's a good question, but again, they're barely getting into space. They're sort of dipping their toes into the shallow end of the pool.
Right. Yeah. Let's get real about those.
Yeah, let's get real. If you want to go to Mars, have at it, Bezos. Send me a postcard.
Just a quick follow up on that. The
having
idea...
having a lovely time in Sidonia.
Or Sedona, as it might be.
Yeah, I know.
I wanted to ask you, following up on that, this idea that we've been thrown off the moon and told not to come back would explain 50 years of a lack of activity of sending a man back to the moon. What do you make of so many rumors along that line?
Well, I think there may be something to it for the very simple reason, like I pointed out in Bastrop, is if you look at ancient lore about the quarantine zone around the Earth, one of the boundaries that they put is at the orbit of the moon. This far and no further. No troops beyond this point. And I strongly suspect that something like that kind of reasoning was behind the fact that when we send out our space probes to wherever, we put these little plaques. We're coming in peace for all mankind. Don't worry, we're just out here taking pictures. Why did they do that?
Yeah.
That's always been my question. And I suspect it's because they suspected that some of those ancient texts talking about wars and quarantine zones and so on may be true, and we better not take the risk if they're not.
Wow. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amazing. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so this is my question. So we have Bob Dean talking about, I think it was in 1964, seeing that there were 4 different types of aliens that they knew about here, and one looked exactly like humans. Who is really running things here?
I suspect, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I suspect that the beginning of the continuity of government operations planning in the 1950s was precisely not simply because they wanted to make sure that some government survived a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, but also because they suspected that there was a possibility of that kind of infiltration of the government.
Oh, yeah.
I really do. I've suspected for a long time, Olivia, that when they're doing all of these genetic tests, the most recent example being the COVID, the swab, that they're really looking for DNA. They're looking for a DNA marker that would identify people like that as a distinguishable population from us.
This came up in relation to airline scanners. Yeah. During the TSA. They were like, why are you using these radiation x-rays when they have a radio scan that can do the same thing? And they were like, no, Chertoff, the head of Homeland Security, went off and started a business doing this stuff. But you made an excellent point, which is they're looking for something in the physiology.
Yeah. If there are such people out there, I call them the genetic cousins. I have for a long time.
Yes.
Because you read those ancient stories of people tinkering with the human genome. They look like us and they walk like us and they talk like us. The only way you would be able to distinguish them would be the genetic marker. So I think it's entirely possible.
So they're part of the genus Homo, but they're not Homo sapien.
Right.
Fascinating.
And we know that a member of a genus can, in certain circumstances, interbreed with a different species, provided they're of the same genus. We do know that.
Okay.
So it makes entire sense.
So do they know? Do all of them know?
Do all of who know?
Do all of who know?
Well, the aliens, the hybrid? I mean, I wonder, could I be walking around and not know?
Yes, I see.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I suspect that if you take those ancient stories of watchers and so on seriously, and I do, that you're going to find people like that not associating with us deplorables. They're going to be much more interested in watching the Angela Merkels and Richard Nixons of the world than they are, a hack from South Dakota. So you're going to find them in those circles. And it's interesting to me, Olivia, Catherine Fitz has told the story many times on her website. She's told me this story that she was actually invited once in Washington to have lunch with an alien.
Yeah.
Just totally seriously.
Yeah.
Nothing,
Yes.
no ifs, ands, or buts. So, they may be aware of them. I don't know. But I don't think you and I are in danger of hobnobbing with these people.
What's amazing about that is she would have had a remarkable lunch. Let's face it.
Yes.
It's true. But we've seen those stories before, everything from Val Thor and all the rest of it. And
Right.
some of it, there's just too much evidence of these people and these interactions. I mean, sure, some of it's psyops, some of it's fantasy, you have junk conspiracy, whatever. But then there's that
sliver of strange stuff.
It is.
And, men in black, women in black, there's all of this lore out there of people meeting very, very strange people.
Yes.
That don't seem to respond in a normal human way.
Right.
To certain situations. And, that's another key, that's another signature. But to be absolutely sure, you'd have to have the genome and be able to sequence it and find anything anomalous. But that's the only way. But behavior, certainly.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. Guys like Frank Edwards wrote extensively about those types of people. He had incredibly high connections politically. He was a good friend of Harry Truman.
Yeah.
Wow. Last question, Miss Olivia.
Easy one. Pulp Buzz. Has Dr. Farrell ever seen a UFO?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've only seen one. And it was when I was living in Spearfish, South Dakota. There was a little 24-hour convenience store a couple of blocks away from my apartment. And one night it was about 2:30 in the morning, I walked down and got myself a soda and was walking back, and I was walking Shiloh. I was walking up a hill, and in the distance you could see Spearfish Mountain kind of silhouetted against the stars. And I looked up and I saw this little thing go whoop. And I looked back. I didn't think anything about it at the time. I took a few more steps, and then I stopped and said, "Whoa!"
Wow.
Because what I had seen was this little. I don't know how to describe it. It was not circular or elliptical or anything like that. It was kind of like an arrowhead, and it was strobing. And it was strobing in such a way that the shape was changing as it was strobing. It still maintained the arrowhead shape, but it was kind of flickering back and forth. And it went zip. And when I realized what I'd just seen, I stopped and I listened, because it had darted behind Spearfish Mountain, which was about 8 miles away. It's a 6,500 foot tall mountain. And it had darted behind that, and it was moving very, very quickly. And so I stopped when I realized what I'd seen to listen, because Ellsworth Air Force Base is just down in Rapid City. So, there's military planes flying around the Black Hills all the time. So I stopped to listen to see if it may have been a helicopter. There was no sound. I listened for a jet sound. There was absolutely no sound.
Wow.
None. It was completely silent. And it was, in my opinion, moving far too quickly to have been a helicopter. And if it was that low, with the B-1 bombers at Ellsworth Air Force Base, it would have made a sound. So I think it was a UFO of some type.
Did you have kind of a strange feeling when you were looking at it?
Well, again, I looked and I saw it, and I didn't think anything about it. It just went zip, I thought, oh, that's a meteor. And then I stopped and realized, no, it's strobing. You know, meteors don't strobe. So,
Wow. My last thing I want to ask on that is, and I don't think I've ever asked you this, which is around the UFO subject over and over again, what you run up against is missing time.
yeah.
Even in sightings, people
Yeah.
say, I saw something, I don't know what happened. And there's always an assumption, oh, you were abducted, and that's where the missing time comes from.
Mhm.
What is missing time?
Oh, a good question. I think to be short about it, because I do have to go, but to be very short about it, I don't think missing time is simply a loss of memory, and I don't think it's a memory that's been intentionally altered. And the reason why is if you're dealing with a genuine hyperdimensional encounter of some sort, it's going to alter the timeline in some fundamental sense. We're back to Mandela effect in a certain way.
Yes.
It's going to alter it in a fundamental way. Now, I do think there are cases, obviously, where you have people that have had memories implanted or tinkered with after the fact. But in some of these cases, you know, I read David Jacobs' book, and some of those cases that he outlines are just very, very bizarre.
Yeah.
And there's no way that I can think of Dr. Jacobs sitting there evilly implanting all these strange tales and no, it's just, you know, that's not a professor of Temple University, you know, sort of thing to be doing.
Exactly.
So I do think there's some sort of fundamental physics behind this time loss phenomenon. I've had the same thing happen to me.
Really?
Oh yeah, I've had some very strange skips. One of them was out in San Mateo, California, and I went up to my room, put my key in the door, and it didn't open. And I knew exactly how many staircases I had to climb to my room, and I climbed that amount of staircases, but I kept trying. I eventually looked at the number on the door, and I was one floor above where I should have been. And how did that happen? I didn't walk that number of stairs. You know, it's just bizarre. You know,
oh wow.
Yeah, just weird stuff. You know.
Well, San Mateo was an interesting thing, because that was the secret space conference.
Yeah.
That'll do it. Joseph, incredible. Of course, your work is available at GizaDeathStar.com. Yep. And your books are available there as well. Mm-hmm. People can join the website. Mm-hmm. And of course, you do all these video and the different web seminars that you do there at the site. People can join. I know people are eagerly anticipating your next book, whatever that happens.
Whenever that may be.
I want to recommend, around the things that we talked about today, Microcosm and Medium, which is a remarkable book that you put out last year. And then one of the older ones, probably The Cosmic War, to give that setup of that early piece. But just remarkable work. And I think that we got, so much of the Mars stuff out that got deleted and torn down last time. So thank you so much.
Well, you know where to find me the next time you want to impersonate a historical event. So
I'll be there. We'll make it the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, gee. All right, take it easy, Daniel.
Good to see you, Joseph.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Have a great one.
Thank you.
You too. Yep, bye-bye. Okay.
It's perfect timing, right? Now think about it. This is amazing because, of course, Joseph Farrell, the two different episodes that got pulled down, and they dealt with everything that we talked about today. But think about it. What was it in what we talked about? There's some factor that made them want to take it down and create this ridiculous excuse, because it wasn't their usual reasons for taking things down. There's no hate speech or anything like that in there. So I had to think to myself over and over again, and it feels to me that there's something in the work of Dr. Farrell relating to Mars that created this in the first place. So we've been going deep with Mars, and when I was talking about it last night, I mentioned Gigi Young really tuning into this early and doing a lot about Mars, and then she and I talking about Mars, and then this becoming just a central piece of what is happening in relation to these groups that are trying to control the human origins narrative and using people like Musk and all the rest is just these kind of bloated billionaires on top, which they've done before with Howard Hughes and others. And that's all the smoke and mirror stuff. The question is, what are they up to? And part of the steganography we got last night with the baseball diamond and home plate and the Spirit rover and on Mars, that was remarkable. So then to have Dr. Farrell come in today and then lay out that whole Mars argument again, now it feels like everything is on time. And it's interesting to me also that those videos got taken down just before that UAP conference in Washington, D.C. that had the illustrious Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, along with Avi Loeb and all the rest of it. It's like they didn't want this competing thing out there. Whatever it happens to be, it was unusual for sure. And there's all sorts of things that we do here with the work that we put out where, you know, we could be censored at any moment. So it's just the way that it goes with this. And of course, my general policy when people have said, well, just don't deal with YouTube, do something else. Well, you know, I have to say, I started this stuff because I wanted to do my own research and I didn't want to be encumbered by that journalistic process where the publisher nixes a story. And I'd seen that happen over and over again. I had no desire to be in that mainstream media world. And so now it seems to me, you know, they're trying to get me to censor myself again. And it's not going to happen. So I'm just going to keep doing the reports that I do. And, you know, we're going to bring the stuff forward. And if groups like YouTube or whatever these platforms, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, you know, they already do things to sabotage the rankings of the channel and all that stuff. I just don't spend a lot of time on it. As long as I can put my message out, I would do it on an iPhone. So I'm just going to continue to do the types of reports and the dark journalism that we do. And I'm not going to move platforms or anything else. What's going to happen is if they want to remove the work that I do from their platforms, then it'll be an action of censorship on their part. I'm not going to make it, you know, something that I do. So that's kind of my position on it. But it is so great to have Dr. Farrell here tonight. Just incredible. And what a great crowd that we had.
A really amazing crowd.
Tell me what are some of those questions you had left over?
Oh, I've got tons. Well, I wanted to ask, there's a lot about Antarctica, as always.
Yes. We'll do another show with Dr. Farrell on Antarctica. I will say this, what's interesting about so many of the things that we've been witnessing is some of the weirdness that we're seeing about Mars with them referencing Mars over and over again. It was happening at the end of the Obama administration in relation to Antarctica. And we remember John Kerry went there and Buzz Aldrin and all the rest of it. So certainly there was a lot going on in relation to that. We are going to be back next Friday with X series episode 113. I'm going to consider this part 2 of what we did last night for episode 112. And we had a great response going through that. And there's no question that the, you know, this statement by the Director of National Intelligence about UFOs buzzing warships and that they are probably extraterrestrial and things like that represent a break in what the establishment has been doing up to now, which is dancing around that question. This is a much more direct approach. And we saw that also from the NASA director, Bill Nelson. So they're up to something. And I think it's in our best interest to try to connect the dots between what they're up to with Mars and then pushing the UAP threat here. So that's the UFO threat is their thing. And they keep trying to brand this term UAP. It's not really working out for them. But one of the things that Dr. Farrell said that I think is so interesting is that he said he didn't feel that their plans were working out. That's pretty wild. And I share that as well, which is some of the whitewash is not going according to plan. So we'll see what their plan B is. As I said before, you know, I feel like the UFO op is the big thing they've had up their sleeve, and it solves a lot of problems because they don't have to explain the 75 years of intense secrecy around that as well. So I think that's kind of important. Mm-hmm. Yes, what do you got?
I was just going to say their brutality is being exposed, right?
Right.
Which is what they don't want.
Right, exactly. That's exactly true.
I would actually reword that and say their lack of humanity,
Lack of
which
humanity.
may have a double meaning.
Yes. So it was great to spend some Saturday time with everyone. I hope some of our European friends who usually can't catch the show live because it's late for them got to check in with us tonight. I'm going to do a few shout outs here.
Before you do that, I've been posting the link to part 2 in BitChute. When is part 3 going to be out?
Well, we have part 3 of that video in the subscriber section. We have the audio for it, but they actually went into the private video forum and took that one down. So we're recalibrating that. Sometime this weekend, we'll have part 3.
So, but if somebody wants the audio version, it's available now for
it is,
subscribers.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. And of course, part 2 is also available there. We put a backup copy of part 2 with Dr. Farrell on BitChute as well. So we got to cover a lot with Dr. Farrell between those 3 videos and today. So certainly there's a clean sweep going on there. But the action of them taking down both of those videos and then taking them out of private servers is kind of remarkable. So there was a reason, basically, they wanted to do that. But we have some people who went through Super Chat. You want to go through those?
Okay. First of all, everybody wants to know your BitChute channel's name.
It's just Dark Journalist, of course. And on Telegram is the other one that people have been joining us on. And that's Real Dark Journalist, because there are all kinds of like fluff dark journalist channels there. And I usually don't pay attention too much to that one. But with Telegram now, it's been a very good alternative to put out there. So I recommend, if you're on Telegram, look for Real Dark Journalist.
Okay, just going to throw this out that Shashkila wants to know, is there any way I can stop PayPal from resubbing me to DJ and send a check? A lot of people want
what you do is you would send an email to admin@darkjournalist.com and they'll take care of that for you. No problem at all.
Okay.
So admin@darkjournalist.com.
All right. So super chatters.
Super chat.
This is going to take a while. Stephen, Debbie McAdoo, Hobu, Bullslaw Toporek, Cursicella, Eurythmia's Fun, Deborah Forbes, Kat Gray, Jamie Linton, Doreen Hewitt, Austin Nichols, Mad Max, Joshua Whelan, Luke Walker, Carol Andrews, Daryl Dothero, Josh Randall, Jim Sarge, 3ID, Glenn Miller, Little Green Men, Nimza Flugzug, Dwell Wayne, Shazam, a cult fan, Buster Blue Sun, Sean Jock, Johnny Ricardo, Man in the Mirror, Thomas Tyson, Gil and Joy R, and D Falcon 61. Thank you so much.
Wow, remarkable. Thanks so much for being with us and supporting us and supporting the work we do here on this program. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate our subscribers and the people who get behind the work that we do here. We will be back next Friday with a new episode, and you might be seeing us actually during the week because there's some breaking stories that are happening in relation to this whole UAP thing that they're trying to gin up. We made a kind of a strong case last night about this Mars site and the NASA scientists using obscure baseball history to cover their bases. This is something you're going to see us do a lot of work on because it's steganography that's opening up. And I can tell you that, Gigi Young and others are going to be helping us get to the bottom of all this, but it's just starting. And we have kind of a big piece of steganography there. Let's see if they continue to use this Satchel Paige thing to get into this Mars ruins idea. It is interesting because they're going to come forward at a certain point and they're gearing up with this human origin story rewrite. That's really why it's crucial for us to be, locked in really well with people on the UFO file side and locked in really well with people who know the deep politics and then those who know things around spirituality and religion and mysticism. This thing all works together. You can't really get a full picture without going into each of these different sides and understanding the kind of mosaic of the full picture. But this is where they're working. This is the area that they're working in, and we have to kind of pay attention to that. As Dr. Farrell was pointing out, they're gearing up to change the narrative, and he's seeing it as the UFO threat aspect that they're going to use. That's the thing that we've been warning about here. They got cold feet last June about this, probably because Elizondo wasn't the person that they thought on the public stage could pull it off. So now they're working Averill, who is the director of national intelligence, but she's a chip off the old block of John Brennan, and he is somebody who could pull this off. So these are the types of things that we're going to be watching, along with the things that we naturally do here in the X series. I'll do a few shout outs for everyone who showed up, and thank you. Richard Weber, it's great to see you out there. Thomas Marzek, Gigi Abby Lynn, there we go. 3 itty bitty, I like that. A cult fan, it's good to see you out there, sir. Man in the Mirror, I like that. Love from Australia. We really appreciate that. And
God bless you in Australia.
Yeah, well, some incredible things are happening. And as I've said over and over again, I think it's an international crisis, and it should be on the top of the kind of UN agenda, and all these countries should be looking at it, because the things that they're doing to the citizens in Australia is beyond belief.
If I could parachute myself down there and help you, I would.
I said at a certain point, it's going to come to people sending in, food and armaments and everything else, because it's just absolutely absurd. And don't tell me that Pine Gap, which is the Australian Area 51, isn't related to that, because that's something that we control completely. Frank Monday, it's good to see you. Karen Pearson, Wayne Peak, Ronan Returns, Olivia Wingsgirl, look at that, you're right in there. Dark Navigator, thank you for being here. Scarlet Fire, Shazam, Nimza, it's great to see you there, sir. Chris A, the Hawthorne Dimension. I know that that's actually Carly with her new Hawthorne Dimension. We're going to find out what that is. I'm telling you, we're going to know. Hopefully, she's going to tell us. Bethany Green, it's great to see you out there. Just remarkable. Thomas Tyson. Thomas Tyson is the Limerick writer. So I'm sure we can have a goodbye Limerick from Thomas. Tricky Vicky, it's great to see you out there. Brenda Fisher. Carolyn Cat Goida.
Oh, I love it. Troll 13 says adopt an Aussie. What a great idea. It is a great idea.
I always had this incredible vision. I've never been to Australia, but I always had this incredible vision of Australia, and was thinking of visiting. We discussed in 2016 a conference in Australia. So all of these kind of things around that have been going on there, absolute shock. And we do want to bring more attention to it, and we certainly will. David Tormina, it's great to see you out there. Great work, open source on Twitter around X themes and other things. Really interesting. Josh Randall, it's great to see you out there. Teresa von Wagner, wow, just a great crowd tonight. Bill Ferry, thank you, sir. We really appreciate that. I know Kate's out there tonight. It's great to see you. Gypsy Moon, thank you. Great show. I appreciate that very much. It was great to be here with all of you. That's the thing. And the fact that we could coordinate it. We didn't know when Dr. Farrell was going to be available. We thought maybe last night. And then he said, well, I'm available today, and we can do it at 5 o'clock. So that's what we took a chance and did it. And boy, it was great to see him. And it sort of got that whole thing about getting those videos taken out. We just exercised that completely. The thing that I brought up tonight in relation to what Judge Napolitano said about the JFK records and Trump telling him we couldn't let those out, you wouldn't believe what's in there. This is something that everyone needs to be on top of on the journalism side and apply the pressure and find out exactly what he was talking about. Now we know, here's another thing, even if they don't release the records, Trump himself can actually come forward.
That's true.
He's got cards to play on that. Especially if they start doing more monkey business with him. And one of the main monkey business players, of course, was our friend Deanna Haynes. She was part of that whole false Russia narrative when they were trying to get Trump not only out of office, but get him out of the running before he even got in. So, whether you're pro or anti, whatever it is, nobody should be subjected to that type of activity by the Central Intelligence Agency.
You want to field that last minute question?
What is it?
From Turd Ferguson. Was Trump's apparent message to Napolitano about JFK made because those documents revealed info that we already suspect, or is it even more sinister?
I think there's something significant now in those files that we hadn't counted on. And I'd heard about, something being preserved in there. And I always thought that was kind of, just wishful thinking. And I always thought, oh, the CIA will scrub all that stuff before it comes out. There may have been a mechanism because of the CIA director that the Kennedys installed at the end after they threw Dulles out. It's possible that they applied a mechanism in there that was kind of like an Easter egg. And obviously something's in there, because if you go back and listen, and I'd like to talk to Judge Napolitano about this, the force with which Trump was saying it to him, he said, Andrew, I can't. You wouldn't believe what's in there. So this is obviously something very significant. And like I said, we know that the Central Intelligence Agency was behind that. There's enough evidence on the table. So it's not that. There's obviously some other piece in there, and I wouldn't be surprised if it related directly to the UFO file. And that's exactly what Dr. Farrell suspected tonight. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yes. Thomas Tyson came up with a limerick for you.
Let's go for it.
There once was a journalist called Dark. His work was no walk in the park. He would lay it all out with confident clout, and he certainly left his mark.
Nicely done, sir. Nobody does it quite like you. Thank you very much. Head Trip, thank you very much for being there. Charles Milligan, I don't think the fake invasion is happening now. Mars being handed back to the indigenous reptiloids. Well, interesting. DJ, how do you think they hid mechanism? What could it be? Yeah. That's referring to the JFK records. It's a real good question. This is interesting to me. I think that there is a way that they could have done it. And now that I've heard Napolitano's conversation, you can understand 58 years later why they're still holding the records back. Because if they had just scrubbed the records, they wouldn't worry about it. Dark Truth, Kevin B., Ivan Langley, great to see all of you here tonight with us. We'll be back with you next Friday. And like I said, you're going to have another surprise during the week. And Miss Olivia, anything else that you caught tonight?
No, that's pretty much it.
Fantastic. Nicely done. Incredible questions. And dealing with it on the spot. And thank you for, being able to spontaneously respond on short notice with this. We will be back. And thanks so much for being there. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch. It's a free newsletter, and it allows us to get around so much of the censorship that we've been seeing. Hopefully this video doesn't get censored, but you never know. In any case, we were back and badder than ever. We will see you all next week. Have a great weekend. And remember also, if you want to subscribe to Dark Journalist, you can do that at darkjournalist.com. And we are going to have some very interesting, fun surprises for our subscribers, including the announcement that there may be some events coming up as well. These are some things that are in discussion now. We'll tell you more about those. And we have some great interviews coming up for you as well. So thank you very much for being here. We will see you all next week. It says end broadcast, but it never really ends.
Nope.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Okay. God bless.
Have a good night. Jelly Jones. There you go. Thanks, everyone.